Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. On a small farm on the outskirts of a bucolic village, there lived a gray-haired, kind-eyed donkey called Federico. For years, he had faithfully served his owner, carrying sacks of grain and bales of hay in the scorching sun and pouring rain. His host knew every stone and every track of those lands like the back of his paw. However, with the passage of time, his legs no longer had the same vigor as before, and his step, once firm and constant, became slower and more hesitant. One particularly cold morning, Federico noticed the worried looks on his owner's face and the whispers of other farmers. "He's too old," they said. "He's not fit for work anymore." Those words penetrated deep into his heart, but instead of giving in to despair, an unusual idea sprang into his mind. He had heard stories about Bremen, a city where music echoed through the streets and art was valued above all else. "Why not?" he thought. "I've always liked to hum in the moonlight. Maybe I could become a musician." With this resolution in his chest, before his owner could make any decisions about his fate, Frederick set off along the dusty road towards Bremen. The road was long, but his determination was greater than any obstacle. He hadn't walked far when his ears picked up a peculiar sound, a tired, melancholy bark coming from behind a bush. There he found Bruno, a black and white shepherd dog, lying in the shade of a tree. His eyes, although tired, still held a spark of liveliness. "Why so sad, friend?" asked Federico, approaching cautiously. "Ah, my dear," Bruno replied with a deep sigh. "After years of guarding my master's flock, my legs are no longer as agile, and my bark no longer scares the wolves as it used to. I overheard my owner saying that I can no longer protect the sheep properly." The story sounded familiar to Frederick, who immediately shared his plans to become a musician in Bremen. "Come with me," the donkey proposed enthusiastically. "Your bark is still strong and melodious. We could form a duo. You bark, I'll bray, and together we'll make music." Bruno's eyes lit up with renewed hope, and without a second thought, he joined Federico on the journey. Not far from there, they found Mingo, an orange cat with white spots, sitting gloomily by the side of the road. His whiskers were down, and his lost gaze wandered over the horizon. "What's your problem, old feline?" asked Bruno, genuinely concerned. "My owner doesn't want me anymore," replied Mingo in an embarrassed voice. "They say I'm too old to hunt mice, that I'm only good for sleeping by the stove, but I can still meow like nobody's business." His green eyes sparkled at the mention of his musical ability. Federico and Bruno exchanged complicit glances. "Perfect," exclaimed the donkey. "You can join us. We're going to Bremen to become musicians. With your meow, my braying, and Bruno's barking, we'll have a spectacular trio." The trio had barely resumed their walk when a shrill sound cut through the air. Cocorico! At the top of a fence, they spotted Galileo, a rooster with multicolored feathers and a vibrant red crest. His posture was proud, but his eyes betrayed a deep sadness. "Why do you sing with such melancholy, feathered friend?" asked Mingo, stretching out to get a better look at the rooster. "I heard the cook saying that tomorrow I'll be turned into soup," replied Galileo, his feathers shaking slightly. "After years of announcing the sunrise, this is my destiny." The rooster's words touched the hearts of his three friends, who immediately invited him to join their peculiar band. "With your majestic crowing, we'll be an unbeatable quartet," declared Federico, already imagining the musical possibilities. Galileo, without a second thought, flapped his wings and landed next to his new friends, ready for a new adventure. United by fate and music, the four unlikely companions set off on the road towards Bremen, each carrying their own dreams and hopes. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as they shared stories of their past lives and dreams for the future. Federico led the group with determined steps. Bruno kept an eye out for any danger. Mingar observed everything with his keen eyes, and Galileo, perched on the darkie's back, served as a lookout. Together, they discovered that their differences were not obstacles, but the source of their strength. As night approached, the group began to realize that the journey would be more challenging than they had imagined. The wind was blowing harder, bringing with it dark clouds that promised rain. They would need to find shelter soon, but they were in a part of the forest that none of them knew. However, the fear of loneliness and abandonment that had previously consumed them individually had been replaced by a sense of belonging and common purpose. "Look," exclaimed Galileo from his lofty post. "There's a light shining between the trees." The four friends looked at each other, curious and hopeful. That mysterious light could mean shelter, danger, or perhaps the start of a new adventure. What they didn't yet know was that this discovery would completely change the course of their lives and lead them to face challenges that would test not only their courage, but also the strength of their newly formed friendship. Cautiously, the group approached the light shining between the trees. As they advanced, a small stone house appeared before them. The smell of hot food escaped through the gaps in the windows, making their stomachs growl in unison. Mingar, with his keen eyesight, was the first to sneak up to one of the low windows. "What do you see?" whispered Bruno, keeping close to his feline friend. "There's a group of bandits inside," replied Mingar, his whiskers twitching with excitement. "They're sitting around a table full of food and drink. They seem to have looted some nearby village." Federico, who had remained silent until then, had a brilliant idea. "Friends," he said quietly, "perhaps we can use our musical skills in a different way. If we manage to scare these bandits, we could not only have a place to sleep, but also do a good deed." The plan was daring, but everyone agreed that it was worth a try. Carefully, they positioned themselves on top of each other. Federico stood at the base, being the biggest and strongest. On top of him climbed Bruno, who helped Mingal balance on his back, and at the top, Galileo perched proudly. "On my signal," whispered Federico, "we all make as much noise as possible." And so they did. The powerful braying of the donkey mixed with the low barking of the dog, the shrill meowing of the cat, and the deafening crowing of the rooster. The resulting sound was something the forest had never witnessed before, a frightening cacophony that echoed through the night. The bandits, taken by surprise, jumped out of their chairs. Through the window, they saw a monstrous creature, tall as a tree, with undefined shapes and terrifying sounds. Without a second thought, they ran out the door, leaving behind the entire banquet and their stolen belongings. Satisfied with the success of their plan, the four friends entered the house, finding it welcoming and well-stocked. "This is better than I could have imagined," exclaimed Bruno, sniffing the air filled with delicious aromas. Mingar soon found a comfortable spot near the fireplace. "Maybe we don't need to go all the way to Bremen," he suggested, purring. "This place could be our new home." However, one of the bandits, braver than the others, decided to go back and investigate. He sneaked up to the house in the darkness. Mingar, who was awake, noticed the movement and alerted the others with a low meow. When the bandit tried to peek through the window, he was met by a set of well-coordinated defenses. Mingar's glowing eyes in the darkness startled him. Bruno bared his teeth with a menacing snarl. Galileo flapped his wings furiously, and Federico gave the intruder a sharp kick in the air, causing him to flee in panic. "They'll never come back," laughed Galileo, smoothing his feathers. "And he'll probably convince the others to stay far away from here." That night was special for the group. For the first time since they had been abandoned by their owners, they felt truly at home. They shared the food left by the bandits and settled in different corners of the house, each finding their perfect spot. Federico discovered a stable next to the house, clean and with fresh hay. Bruno chose a soft rug near the door, where he could keep guard. Mingo appropriated an old armchair near the fireplace, and Galileo found a perfect beam for his perch. As the evening progressed, the four friends chatted about their future plans. "You know," said Frederick thoughtfully, "maybe our destination wasn't really to get to Bremen. Maybe it was to find each other and create our own home." "And who says we can't do both?" suggested Bruno, wagging his tail. "We can turn this house into our home and still make music." The idea excited everyone. They started planning how they could improve the place, turning it into a real home for musical animals. Galileo suggested that they could give concerts for travelers passing by on the road. Mingar thought about creating an aromatic herb garden. Bruno offered to maintain security, and Federico offered to transport supplies from the nearest village. As they made plans, they realized that their skills complemented each other perfectly. What one couldn't do, the other could. Their limitations, which had previously been seen as a reason to discard them by their former owners, were now transformed into opportunities for cooperation and mutual help. The night passed quietly, with the quartet resting for the first time in a long time without fear of tomorrow. The sound of rain began to fall softly on the roof, creating a natural melody that lulled them into a deep, comforting sleep. In the morning, the first rays of sunlight found the four friends already awake and excited. Galileo, true to his custom, was the first to greet the day with his characteristic song. Mingar lounged lazily in his armchair, while Bruno made his morning rounds around the house. Federico watched everything with satisfaction, feeling that they had finally found their place in the world. The next few days were filled with intense activity in the forest house. As time went by, each member of the group found their own way of contributing to making the space truly special. Federico, with his still considerable strength, started carrying useful materials he found around the forest, including fallen boards and abandoned tools that could be useful for small repairs. Bruno developed a patrol routine, marking a safe perimeter around the property and alerting his friends to any suspicious movement. His bark, which had previously been considered too weak to protect sheep, proved perfectly adequate to keep his new home safe. Mingar, for his part, turned out to be an excellent gardener. Using his natural hunting skills, he not only kept the house free of mice, but also started growing a small herb garden near the kitchen window. His nimble paws were perfect for planting seeds and pulling weeds. Galileo, from the top of his perch, not only faithfully announced the sunrise, but also kept an eye on his surroundings and reported on the weather, accurately predicting the arrival of storms thanks to his natural instincts. His constant presence at the highest point of the house made him a reliable watchman. One particularly pleasant morning, while they were practicing their music in the yard, they heard the sound of human voices approaching from the road. At first, they were apprehensive, fearing that it was the bandits returning. However, to their surprise, it was a group of children from the nearby village, attracted by the curious melody echoing through the forest. "Look at that," one of the children exclaimed in amazement. "They're animals that make music." The quartet, who had initially thought of hiding, realized that this could be a unique opportunity. Federico, assuming his role as leader, stepped forward and began an impromptu performance. His melodious braying was soon joined by Bruno's rhythmic barking, Mingar's harmonious meowing, and Galileo's vibrant singing. The children were delighted, clapping their hands and dancing to the unusual music. Soon, they began to bring other villagers to watch the quartet perform. Word of the animal musicians living in the forest spread quickly, and their performances began to attract regular visitors. As their popularity grew, the four friends decided to organize their concerts better. They transformed their backyard into a small performance area, with lawns arranged as seats for the audience. Galileo, with his natural talent for entertaining, became the master of ceremonies, announcing each musical number with a specially made cocorico. Visitors often brought gifts: fresh hay for Frederick, juicy bones for Bruno, balls of wool for Mingar to play with, and special grains for Galileo. More important than the material gifts, however, was the respect and admiration they received. Those same animals that had been discarded for being too old were now celebrated for their unique abilities. One afternoon, while they were organizing yet another performance, they received an unexpected visit. A group of merchants passing along the road stopped to watch the show, and among them was a man who caught Bruno's eye. He was his former owner. The old sheepdog was tense for a moment, but his friends immediately stood by his side in silent support. To his surprise, the former owner approached with tears in his eyes. "Bruno, my old friend," he said in an embarrassed voice, "I see you found your true calling." Forgive me for not seeing your full potential." That moment deeply touched not only Bruno, but all four friends. They realized that their supposed limitations had become their greatest strengths, and that the abandonment they had suffered had led them to find something much more precious, a chosen family. As their fame grew, they began to receive invitations to perform in the nearby village. After much discussion, they decided to accept some special performances, but always keeping their home in the forest as their base. After all, that place had become much more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of their freedom and unity. During one of these performances in the village, they met other animals who, like them, had been abandoned by their owners. This sparked an idea in Federico. Why not turn his house into a refuge for animal artists? The space was big enough, and they could teach others to discover their hidden talents. "We could create a real music school," suggested Mingo, enthusiastic about the idea. "And each of us could teach something different," added Bruno, already imagining the possibilities. Galileo, from his favorite perch, agreed with an excited poop. "We could call it the Forest Musical Academy." The idea quickly took shape. Before long, they began to welcome their first students. A pig who discovered he had a talent for percussion, a sheep with a surprisingly melodious voice, and even a mouse who turned out to be an excellent dancer. The house in the forest, which once housed bandits, became a center for art and music, a place where differences were celebrated and limitations were transformed into possibilities. The four friends discovered that their true calling went beyond simply making music. It was to inspire others to find their own voice. With the Academia Musical de Floresta up and running, the four friends' routine took on new contours and challenges. Every morning, after Galileo's traditional song greeting the sun, the house was filled with life with the arrival of different students, each bringing their own story and dreams. Federico discovered that he had a natural talent for teaching. His patience and wisdom, acquired through years of hard work, allowed him to identify the unique potential in each student. He developed a special method for teaching rhythm, using his own experiences of carrying bales of hay to create simple, engaging musical patterns. "You see," he explained to a group of young rabbits who wanted to learn to drum with their hind legs, "every step can be a musical note. The secret is to find your own natural rhythm." The bunnies, fascinated, began to drum on the floor, creating a synchronized percussion that soon became one of the favorite attractions of the performances. Bruno, for his part, became an expert in teaching vocal techniques. His bark, which had previously been considered too weak to scare off predators, turned out to be perfect for demonstrating different tones and modulations. He worked especially closely with a young sheep called Melody, whose initial shyness hid an extraordinary voice. "Don't be afraid to be different," Bruno advised Melody during a lesson. "Sometimes what we consider our greatest weakness can be our greatest strength." Under his tutelage, Melody developed the confidence that transformed her bleating into a song so sweet it often attracted wild birds to listen. Mingo revolutionized dance teaching at the academy. His naturally graceful feline movements inspired students to find their own form of body expression. He created a particularly interesting partnership with Roberto, the dancing mouse, developing choreographies that combined agility and elegance. "Dance is everywhere," taught Mingo, demonstrating a sequence of movements. In the way the wind sways the leaves, in the course of a stream, even in the way the butterflies fly. His students learned to observe nature in search of inspiration, transforming everyday movements into art. Galileo, in addition to his duties as a watchman and announcer, developed a special program to teach music to migratory birds. His knowledge of weather patterns and celestial navigation proved invaluable in creating a system of musical notation based on the flight of birds. "Each migration route is like a score in the sky," he explained to his winged students. "The air currents are our stage, and the wind is our orchestra." Soon, the skies above the academy were filled with coordinated melodies, with flocks of birds performing complex aerial harmonies. The fame of the Forest Music Academy grew so much that it began to attract visitors from further and further afield. One day, a delegation of human musicians from the city of Bremen even arrived, intrigued by the stories they had heard about the animal musicians. "We never imagined we'd find something like this," commented the leader of the delegation, amazed at a special performance organized to welcome them. "You've created something truly unique here." Success, however, brought with it new challenges. The house began to get too small to accommodate all the students and visitors. What's more, with winter approaching, they needed to find a way to continue classes during the colder days. It was Federico who came up with the idea of expanding the facilities, taking advantage of an old cave next to the house. "The natural acoustics of the cave would be perfect for rehearsals," he suggested, "and it would give us the additional space we need." With the help of all the students and some villagers who had become loyal friends of the academy, work began on adapting the cave. The student beavers created dikes to control the humidity, the moles helped to create natural acoustic chambers, and the birds decorated the ceiling with small shiny stones that reflected the light of the lanterns. During the construction work, they discovered something surprising. The cave had several interconnected chambers, each with unique acoustic characteristics. This allowed them to create specialized rooms for different types of musical practice. "It's as if nature itself had designed a concert hall for us," observed Bruno, delighted by the perfect reverberation of his bark in one of the chambers. Working together to expand the academy further strengthened the bonds between the four friends and their students. Each challenge overcome was celebrated with a new musical composition, created collaboratively by teachers and students. One evening, as they rested after a long day's work, Federico reflected on how their lives had changed since that first encounter on the road. "When we set off in search of Bremen," he told his friends, "we thought we were looking for a place to make music. But in fact, we found something much bigger, a way to turn our experiences into lessons for others." With the Forest Music Academy flourishing and the new expansion in the cave nearing completion, the four friends started planning a big music festival to celebrate their first successful year. The idea was to bring together all the students, past and present, for a memorable performance that would demonstrate how music could transcend all differences. While they were organizing the event, one afternoon they were surprised by the unexpected visit of a peculiar group. They were the old bandits who had escaped from the house that first night. However, this time they didn't come with bad intentions. The leader of the group, a tall man with a gray beard, approached cautiously with his hands raised in a sign of peace. "We've come to ask for forgiveness," he said, visibly embarrassed. "We've been watching from afar the wonderful work you've been doing here. Our life of crime brought us only loneliness and fear, while you have built something truly special." Federico, ever the diplomat of the group, stepped forward. "Forgiveness is the first step towards change," he replied wisely. "Perhaps you too can discover your musical talents." To everyone's surprise, the former bandits revealed that, during their time as fugitives, they had developed the habit of making music with objects found in the forest. The leader demonstrated how he could create fascinating melodies by banging on hollow logs of different sizes, while his companions accompanied him with whistles and rhythmic clapping. "Look at that!" exclaimed Mingo, his green eyes shining with excitement. Even those who scared us at first had music inside them. The arrival of the former bandits brought a new dimension to the planned festival. Bruno suggested incorporating their improvised instruments into the performance, creating a unique percussion section that would perfectly represent the inclusive spirit of the academy. Galileo, always on the lookout for opportunities to expand, proposed an even more ambitious idea. "Why don't we turn the festival into a traveling celebration? We could start here in the forest and end up in Bremen, giving performances in every village along the way." The suggestion was met with enthusiasm. Preparations for the traveling festival began immediately. Each group of students worked on special performances that highlighted their unique skills. The percussionist rabbits created a synchronized choreography with melody. The singing sheep, Roberto, the dancing mouse, developed a special number with the migratory birds, combining ground dancing with aerial acrobatics. During rehearsals, something extraordinary began to happen. Wild animals from the forest, attracted by the music, began to come forward voluntarily to take part. One bear discovered that his low growl matched Federico's braying perfectly in certain tunes. A family of squirrels developed a percussion technique using nuts and pine cones that added a unique layer to the compositions. As the day of the festival approached, word spread in all directions. Caravans began to arrive in the forest, bringing curious spectators and potential new students. The small house that once housed bandits was now the epicenter of a true musical revolution. On the morning of the big day, Galileo woke everyone up with his most majestic cocorico. The festival began at sunrise with a joint performance by all the participants. The music that echoed through the forest that morning was unlike anything they had ever created. It was the sum of all their experiences, hopes, and dreams. The musical caravan set off from the forest as planned, stopping at each village on the way to Bremen. At each stop, new elements were added to the performance. A goat that played the flute with its nose joined the group in one village. In another, a group of pigs discovered that they could create complex harmonies with their grunts. Finally, after 2 weeks of travel, they arrived in Bremen. The city that was initially just a dream destination for a lonely donkey was now hosting the biggest animal music festival ever seen. The streets were filled with amazed spectators, and even the most skeptical human musicians were won over by the unique harmony created by the unlikely orchestra. During the final performance in Bremen's central square, Federico looked at his friends and all the students who had turned his simple dream into something much bigger. He realized that his journey had never really been about getting to Bremen. It was about discovering that music existed everywhere and in everyone. The festival was such a success that the Bremen authorities offered the Forest Music Academy an official title of Royal Conservatory for Animals. However, after much discussion, the four friends decided to keep their base in the forest, where it all began. Our music was born out of freedom and acceptance, Federico explained to the city officials. We need to keep our roots where we can continue to grow naturally. The decision proved wise. The Forest Musical Academy continued to flourish, becoming a symbol of how music can unite the most unlikely of companions and turn limitations into possibilities. The four friends, Federico, Bruno, Mingo, and Galileo, discovered that their true mission was not just to make music, but to show the world that every voice, no matter how different, deserves to be heard. And so the story of the Bremen musicians became much more than a simple fable about animals who wanted to be musicians. It became a testament to the power of friendship, the courage to start again, and the magic that happens when different voices come together in harmony. The sun was setting over the horizon of Athens, painting the sky with shades of orange and red reminiscent of spilled blood. Theseus, son of the Aegean king, watched from the palace balcony as young people wept in the embrace of their families. It was time for the terrible tribute that Athens owed Crete. 7 boys and 7 girls were to be sent to the labyrinth of the Minotaur. This cruel tradition had its origins in an ancient war between the two kingdoms. After the death of his son Androgeus on Athenian soil, King Minos of Crete, overcome by fury and the power of a superior army, imposed this punishment on the city. Every 9 years, 14 young men would be sacrificed to feed the monstrous Minotaur, the fruit of the unnatural union between Queen Pasiphae and a magnificent white bull sent by Poseidon. Theseus felt the weight of responsibility on his young but strong shoulders. Ever since he was a boy, he had heard stories about the labyrinth built by the genius Daedalus, a prison so complex that no human being had ever been able to find their way out after entering its winding corridors. The prince ran a hand through his dark hair, pensive, as he watched the movement in the harbor, where the black ship with sails of the same color awaited its human cargo. "My son," the deep voice of King Aegeus sounded behind him. "You don't have to do that. We've already lost too many young men to that freak." The old king put his hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes full of concern. Theseus turned to face him, determination shining in his gaze. "That's precisely why, father. I must go. I can't stand by while our people suffer. I am the Prince of Athens, and it is my duty to protect our citizens." His voice was firm but gentle. "Besides, I've been trained by the best warriors. If anyone stands a chance against the Minotaur, it's me. The king sighed heavily, knowing he wouldn't be able to dissuade his stubborn son. Then take this, he said, removing a ruby ring from his finger, so that you remember your home and your duty to return. The next morning, the port was packed, families said goodbye, mothers hugged their children as if their lives depended on it, and fathers tried to keep their composure while silent tears streamed down their wrinkled cheeks. Theseus voluntarily came forward as one of the 7 boys, causing a stir among the people watching. The ship set sail under a cloudy sky, as if the gods themselves shared in the Athenian morning. During the voyage, Theseus met his companions in misfortune. There was Callias, a young scribe who kept scribbling on a small piece of parchment as if he wanted to record every moment of his last days. Helen, a golden-haired girl who sang sad songs to calm the others. Pericles, a strong young man who had been drawn despite the protests of his pregnant fiancée. As they approached Crete, the fear in the young men's eyes grew. Some prayed to the gods, others simply remained silent, gazing at the horizon as if searching for answers in the waves of the sea. Theseus spent his time planning, observing and mentally preparing himself for what was to come. After 3 days of travel, Crete appeared on the horizon like a sleeping giant over the sea. The palace of Knossos, the seat of power of King Minos, was an imposing construction that seemed to defy the mountains themselves. Its multiple floors and terraces rose towards the sky, and its walls were decorated with colorful frescoes that told stories of glory and power. When the ship docked, Cretan guards escorted them through the harbor to the palace. It was then that Theseus saw her for the first time. Ariadne, the princess of Crete, was watching the Athenians arrive from one of the palace balconies. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something inexplicable passed between them, an instant connection that made the prince's heart race. King Minos welcomed them into his throne room, an imposing man with a golden crown and eyes as cold as the sea in a storm. Beside him, Queen Pasiphae kept her gaze downcast, bearing the weight of shame for the monstrous son she had borne. Ariadne was there too, closer now, and Theseus could see the compassion in her dark eyes. "Welcome, Athenians," King Minos' voice echoed through the hall with a false cordiality. "Tomorrow at dawn, you will fulfill your destiny in the labyrinth. Tonight, rest and enjoy our hospitality. It will be your last meal." During the forced banquet that followed, Theseus noticed the furtive glances Ariadne cast at him. The princess seemed restless, as if she wanted to say something, but the dozens of watchful eyes of the guards and courtiers made any communication impossible. That night, in his temporary quarters, Theseus couldn't sleep. The distant sound of the sea mixed with the muffled sobs coming from the other young men's rooms. He thought of his father, of Athens, of the monster he would have to face, and of Ariadne, whose mysterious eyes never left his mind. Then he heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, he found a servant who, without saying a word, handed him a small package and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Inside the package was a skein of golden thread that shone in the moonlight and a note written in delicate handwriting. "Meet me in the fountain garden at midnight." Theseus' heart raced. He knew that this could be both a trap and his only hope of survival. But something deep inside him told him that he could trust Ariadne. Stowing the golden bowl in his tunic, he prepared himself for an encounter that would change not only his fate, but that of all Athenians. Shadows danced through the palace corridors as Theseus moved silently towards the gardens. The full moon illuminated his path across the elaborate mosaics of the floor, each step calculated to avoid the watchful eye of the guards patrolling the corridors. The golden bowl weighed down his tunic, constantly reminding him of the mystery that awaited him. The fountain garden was a place of rare beauty. Even at night, crystal clear water gushed from a statue of Poseidon, and the soft sound created a natural curtain that could cover up whispered conversations. Theseus found Ariadne already waiting for him, her graceful silhouette cut out against the silvery moonlight. She wore a dark blue cloak that blended in with the shadows, her black hair tied up in an elaborate braid. "You've come," she whispered, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We only have a short time. The guards will be changing shifts soon." "Why are you helping me?" Theseus asked, keeping a respectful distance, but unable to hide his curiosity. Ariadne approached, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm tired of seeing innocent young people die because of cruel punishment. What my father is doing, it's not justice, it's revenge. In the Minotaur," she hesitated, "that creature shouldn't exist. It's an abomination born of pride and shame." She quickly explained about the golden thread, a special creation of Daedalus, the same architect who had built the labyrinth. "The thread is enchanted," she said. "It never breaks and always shows the way back. Tie it at the entrance and unwind it as you go. But remember, the labyrinth isn't just a set of corridors. It changes, it moves, it tries to confuse the mind." Theseus held the ball tighter, feeling its peculiar warmth. "How can I be sure this isn't a trap?" "You can't," Ariadne answered honestly. "But if I wanted you dead, I just have to wait until tomorrow." Her eyes filled with restrained tears. "There's something else you need to know about the Minotaur. He's not just strong, he's intelligent. My half-brother," her voice faltered, "he understands our language. He can think like a man, but the fury of the bull dominates him. Years of isolation have made him more monster than human." A distant noise startled them both. Footsteps of guards were approaching. Ariadne quickly took something from her robes, a small bronze dagger with engraved symbols. This blade was blessed by priestesses. It may not be enough to kill the Minotaur, but it will help you defend yourself. Theseus accepted the weapon, feeling its comforting weight. "Why are you risking so much for me?" "Because I saw something in your eyes that was different from the others," she replied, her cheeks blushing slightly. "I saw hope, not just fear. And maybe," she hesitated, "maybe you're the one who could put an end to all this suffering." The footsteps came closer and closer. Ariadne cast an anxious glance down the corridor. "There's one more thing," she whispered hurriedly. "If you succeed, when you defeat the Minotaur, take me with you. I can no longer live in this palace of lies and cruelty." Before Theseus could reply, she quickly leaned over and kissed his cheek, a touch as soft as butterfly wings. The next moment, she had disappeared into the shadows of the garden, leaving only the scent of night flowers in the air. Theseus returned to his chambers with his mind in turmoil. The golden bowl and dagger hidden in his tunic seemed to burn against his skin, physical reminders of the pact he had just made. His initial plan to confront the Minotaur had turned into something much more complex. Now it was not only his life and that of the young Athenians at stake, but also the future of a princess who was risking everything to help him. Lying on his bed, looking up at the ceiling decorated with paintings of maritime scenes, Theseus planned every step of the next day. His father's ring shone on his finger, reminding him of his promise to return. Ariadne's dagger was hidden in his robes, along with the bowl of yarn that could mean the difference between life and death in the labyrinth. The first rays of the sun were beginning to tint the horizon when Theseus finally managed to sleep, his dreams populated by endless corridors, dark, compassionate eyes, and the menacing shadow of a half-man, half-bull creature. The weight of responsibility had never been so great, but he had never felt so prepared to face it. Dawn brought with it the sound of trumpets announcing the start of the ritual. The guards came to collect the young Athenians, who were taken to a courtyard where priests performed the last blessings. Theseus watched his companions, some weeping silently, others maintaining a stoic dignity in the face of the fate that awaited them. At the top of a staircase, King Minos presided over the ceremony with a cruel smile on his lips. Beside him, Ariadne kept her face impassive, but her eyes met those of Theseus for a brief moment, conveying a silent message of hope and determination. Queen Pasiphae was not present, as she always was on these occasions, unable to witness the terrible fate of the young victims. As the guards led them towards the entrance to the labyrinth, Theseus felt the weight of the golden bowl against his chest and the cold touch of the dagger hidden in his robes. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, the chance to change the fate not only of Athens, but also of Crete. The entrance to the labyrinth revealed itself as an immense bronze door, its jambs decorated with reliefs that told stories of horror and suffering. The air emanating from the darkness beyond was cold and laden with an ancient smell, a mixture of mold and something more sinister that Theseus couldn't identify. The priest chanted darkly as the 14 young men were lined up in front of the entrance. Theseus noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he discreetly tied the end of the golden thread to a small iron ring near the entrance. He made sure the knot was tight, remembering Ariadne's words about the enchantment of the thread. "May the gods have mercy on their souls," declared the high priest, his voice echoing through the stone courtyard. At his signal, the guards began to push the young men into the labyrinth. Theseus entered last, taking one last look at the open sky. He saw Ariadne on the balcony, her tiny figure against the grandeur of the palace. She put her hand to her chest in a gesture that only he would understand, where the dagger was hidden in her own clothes. The darkness swallowed them up quickly. The sound of the bronze door closing behind them echoed like a final sentence. Some of the young people began to cry. Others hugged each other in search of comfort. Torches on the walls lit up automatically, revealing corridors stretching out in all directions. "We need to stay together," said Helena, the golden-haired girl, her voice trembling but determined. "No," replied Theseus, surprising everyone. "The Minotaur will find us more easily if we are grouped together. We need to split up, but we'll die alone," protested Callias, the scribe, clutching his parchment to his chest. Theseus looked at each of them. "Listen up. I have a plan. When I find the Minotaur, I'm going to fight him. You need to hide, seek shelter in niches and side passages. If you hear me," he hesitated, "if you hear me shouting, run in the opposite direction." Pericles, the young groom, stepped forward. "I won't let you fight alone." "You must," insisted Theseus. "Your fiancé is expecting a son. If I fail, you'll have to find another way." Reluctantly, the group began to split up. Theseus watched as they disappeared into different corridors, their footsteps echoing further and further away. Alone now, he began his own journey, carefully unwinding the golden thread. The labyrinth was a masterpiece of engineering and evil. Corridors ended abruptly in smooth walls. Stairs led to impossible places, and some passages seemed to change direction as they were traversed. Theseus kept an eye out for the signs Ariadne had mentioned, small marks on the walls that indicated the proximity of the labyrinth's center. Time lost its meaning in the bowels of the labyrinth. Minutes could be hours, and hours could be days. The only certainty was the golden thread that glowed softly, marking the path taken. From time to time, Theseus heard distant cries. Echoes of voices that could be his companions were just tricks of the labyrinth. The first real sign that he was approaching the center came in the form of marks on the walls, deep scratches made by powerful claws or horns. Occasional bones lay in the corners, some still with scraps of fabric stuck to them. Theseus pressed the dagger into his tunic, feeling his heart race. Then he heard it, a deep, reverberating sound, half roar, half human groan. The ground shook slightly beneath his feet. Theseus pressed himself against a wall, controlling his breathing. The sound was closer now, accompanied by heavy footsteps that made the torches flicker. "I can smell you, Athenian." A guttural voice echoed through the corridors, startling Theseus with its clarity. Ariadne was right. The Minotaur could speak. "Your fear is sweet, like all the others before you." Theseus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He remembered his training, the fights he had won, Ariadne's look of hope. When he opened them again, he was ready. "I'm not afraid of you, Ariadne's brother," he answered aloud, surprising himself with the firmness of his words. "I'm sorry." A roar of fury shook the walls. The footsteps became faster, more determined. Theseus gripped the dagger tightly, his body as tense as a bowstring. The moment that would change the fate of two cities was at hand. A monstrous shadow appeared on the opposite wall, cast by the light of the torches. The creature moved with surprising grace for its size. Theseus could hear its heavy breathing, feel the heat emanating from its massive body. pity." The Minotaur's voice was closer, laden with bitterness. "You know nothing about me, Prince of Athens. About loneliness, about being a prisoner in your own home, about being feared by your own mother." Theseus felt an unexpected pang of compassion. For a moment, he saw the situation through the creature's eyes. Born of a forbidden love, condemned to live in the shadows, fed human flesh by a father who despised him. But there was no time for philosophizing. The Minotaur appeared around the bend in the corridor, its imposing figure blocking the entire passage. It was even more impressive than the stories described, taller than two men, rippling muscles covered in dark fur, long horns as sharp as swords. Its eyes, however, were disturbingly human, shining with intelligence and fury. "Then let's get this over with," said the Minotaur, lowering his head in an attacking position. "Show me if your feather is worth anything when you're being dismembered." The ensuing battle would echo through the corridors of the labyrinth, a struggle not just between man and beast, but between fate and free will, between the curse of the past and the hope of the future. The golden thread glowed softly on the floor, a silent witness to the clash that was about to begin. The confrontation exploded in quick, precise movements. The Minotaur charged at Theseus, who dodged at the last moment, feeling the displacement of air caused by the sharp horns passing inches from his body. The narrow corridor limited the creature's movements, giving the prince a slight advantage. Nimble as a mouse, roared the Minotaur, turning with surprising speed. But everyone tires eventually. Theseus kept his distance, studying his opponent's movements. Years of combat training had taught him the importance of patience. The bronze dagger pulsed in his hand, as if responding to the creature's presence. "Why do you continue to serve Minos?" asked Theseus, dodging another attack. "He keeps you prisoner, uses you as an instrument of terror." A bitter laugh echoed off the walls. "And where would I go? Look at me. The outside world would hunt me down like an animal." The Minotaur attacked again, this time managing to tear off a piece of Theseus' tunic with its claws. The fight took them deeper into the labyrinth, through narrower and narrower corridors. The golden thread snaked behind them, glowing softly. In a moment of distraction, Theseus tripped over an ancient bone, momentarily losing his balance. The Minotaur seized the opportunity, its huge claw closing around the prince's arm. The pain was immediate and intense. Theseus felt himself being lifted off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "Your fine words cannot change what I am," roared the Minotaur, bringing his face close to the prince's. His breath was hot and charged. His breath was hot and carried the metallic smell of blood. With a desperate move, Theseus drove his dagger into the creature's shoulder. The enchanted bronze penetrated the flesh with surprising ease, causing the Minotaur to cry out in pain and let go. The prince fell heavily, rolling away as his opponent struggled. "Damn it," thundered the Minotaur, pulling out the dagger and throwing it away. Black blood oozed from the wound. The smell, this metal has been blessed by priestesses. Her eyes narrowed with understanding. "Ariadne, my own sister betrayed me. She wants to end this cycle of death," replied Theseus, frantically searching for a makeshift weapon. His fingers found a long, sturdy bone. "It's not betrayal to want justice." "Justice?" The Minotaur's laugh was full of bitterness. "Where was justice when I was locked up here as a child? When my own mother couldn't look me in the eye?" The fight resumed with renewed intensity. Theseus used his agility to compensate for his opponent's brute strength, looking for an opening. The bone in his hands broke when he parried a particularly strong blow, but it served to deflect the deadly horns. In the midst of the fight, distant shouts echoed through the corridors. The other young Athenians, probably discovered by the guards who occasionally patrolled the labyrinth. The Minotaur smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "Looks like your friends have run into trouble," he teased. "Maybe you should have stayed with them instead of trying to take me on." Theseus knew he had to end this quickly. His companions needed him, and every moment of fighting diminished his chances of survival. He observed his surroundings, noticing a torch that cast dancing shadows on the walls. With one swift movement, he snatched the torch from its holder and brandished it at the Minotaur. The creature recoiled instinctively. Even though it was partially human, the ancestral fear of fire was present in its taurine nature. "You don't have to die," said Theseus, stepping forward with the torch. "We can find another way." For a moment, something akin to hope shone in the creature's eyes. But it was soon replaced by anger. "There is no other way for me. This labyrinth is my prison in my kingdom, and here you will meet your end." The Minotaur charged with all his might, ignoring the torch. Theseus waited until the last moment before throwing himself to the side, using the monster's own strength against him. The horns dug deep into the stone wall, momentarily trapping the creature. At that crucial moment, Theseus saw his dagger lying a few paces away. He rolled towards the weapon, grabbing it as the Minotaur broke free with a roar of fury. The creature turned around, blood dripping from its damaged horns, its eyes now completely dominated by bestial fury. "You're fast, Prince," it growled, "but you're getting tired. I can feel your heart racing, your fear sweating." "It's not fear," replied Theseus, wielding his dagger. "It's determination." The narrow corridor echoed with the sounds of battle, metal against claw, flesh against stone, roars and cries of exertion. The golden thread shone ever more brightly, as if responding to the violence of the confrontation. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate, man and beast dancing a deadly choreography in the confines of a labyrinth. The fate of two cities, the future of a princess, and the lives of innocent young people hung by a thread, as delicate as the golden ball that marked the path through the darkness. And amid the chaos of combat, an ancient truth echoed through the corridors. Sometimes the real monsters are not those who bear horns and claws, but those who create them and imprison them in the shadows. The decisive moment came when the Minotaur, at his fiercest, crashed into an ancient calm. The impact caused stones from the ceiling to crumble, creating a shower of debris. Theseus took advantage of the momentary distraction to execute a move he had practiced hundreds of times in his training, a precise and deadly blow. The dagger found its target between the creature's ribs, penetrating deep into its heart. The Minotaur staggered, its eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and, surprisingly, relief. "So, this is how it ends," muttered the creature, its voice losing its bestial fury and taking on an almost human tone. Maybe it's for the best." Black blood oozed from the wound as he leaned against the wall. Theseus maintained his combat stance, but something about the vulnerability of the moment struck him. "You could have chosen another path," he said softly. "No," replied the Minotaur, sliding down to sit on the floor. "This has always been my destiny. Take care. Take care of Ariadne. She was always the only one who saw me as something more than a monster." With these words, the creature exhaled its last breath. Theseus remained silent for a moment, paying silent respect to the being who, despite everything, was also a victim of the cruelty of men and the whims of the gods. The distant sound of screams brought him back to reality. His companion still needed him. Following the golden thread, Theseus ran through the corridors, first finding Helen and Callias hiding in a niche. Soon after, he located Pericles and 3 other young men. One by one, they came together, guided by the light of the enchanted thread. "The guards," warned one of the girls. "They've entered the labyrinth behind us." "Follow the thread," ordered Theseus. "It will lead you to the exit. I'll delay the guards." "We can't leave him," protested Pericles. "You can and you must," insisted Theseus. "Your mission now is to take the news to Athens. The Minotaur is dead. The bloody tribute is over." Reluctantly, the young men followed the golden path while Theseus faced the guards in the labyrinthine corridors. His combat experience and knowledge of the way through the wire gave him the advantage. One by one, the Cretan soldiers were neutralized or disoriented in the darkness of the labyrinth. When she finally emerged into daylight, she found the courtyard in chaos. Ariadne had fulfilled her part of the plan, creating a distraction that allowed the young Athenians to reach the port. The black ship was waiting for them, its sails already unfurled in the wind. "Theseus," Ariadne's voice cut through the air. She was running towards them, pursued by guards. "My father? He's found out everything." King Minos' furious roar echoed through the courtyard. "Traitor! My own daughter plotted against Crete." Theseus grabbed Ariadne's hand, and together they ran towards the harbor. Behind them, chaos ensued in the palace, servants running, guards shouting orders, and above all, the thunderous voice of Minos promising revenge. The road to the ship seemed endless. Arrows whizzed around them, some whizzing dangerously close. Theseus could see his companions on the deck, gesticulating frantically. Pericles and 2 other stronger boys had stayed behind to help them escape, keeping the guards at bay with improvised oars as weapons. With a last-ditch effort, Theseus and Ariadne jumped onto the ship just as the moorings were being cut. The wind filled the black sails, and slowly the ship began to move away from the quay. "It's not over," roared Minos from the dock. "The gods will avenge this betrayal." Ariadne, panting but determined, faced her father one last time. "The gods have already avenged us, father. Their cruelty created their own monsters, and now they are no more." As Crete receded into the horizon, Theseus watched the young Athenians. Now free, their lives ahead of them. Some wept with relief. Others laughed nervously, hardly believing in their survival. Ariadne stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the future that awaited them. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Theseus touched his father's ring, remembering his promise to return. "First we go back to Athens." Then he smiled. "Then we build something new, something better than labyrinths and sacrifices." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with the same colors that Theseus had seen on his last night in Athens. But now these colors didn't resemble blood. They resembled possibilities, new beginnings, the promise of a future where monsters no longer had to be created or imprisoned. The golden ball, still attached to his tunic, shone with the last rays of the sun, as if approving of the direction their lives were taking. On the horizon, Athens awaited them, and with it, the chance to tell a different story, not just one of heroism and monsters, but of compassion, change, and redemption. As the ship cut through the waters of the Aegean Sea, Theseus knew that there were still battles to come. Minos would not rest easy, and the gods were known for their capriciousness. But for now, it was enough to know that 14 young people were breathing the air of freedom, that a princess had chosen her own destiny, and that in the depths of a labyrinth in Crete, a cycle of violence had finally come to an end. In the bustling streets of Agrabah, where the intense sun turned the sand into a golden carpet, Aladdin leapt nimbly between the market stalls. His bare feet already knew every stone and every shortcut in the city that was both his home and his playground. With his shaggy black hair and threadbare clothes, he might have looked like just another young beggar to the hurried shopkeepers. But his charismatic smile and sparkling eyes revealed a different soul. "Catch thief!" The cry echoed through the market as Aladdin, with a loaf of newly acquired bread under his arm, deftly dodged the crowd. Beside him, his faithful companion Abu, a small brown-furred monkey, chirped excitedly, also carrying his share of the booty. "It's not stealing to survive, is it, Abu?" Aladdin winked at his furry friend as he dodged down a narrow alleyway. The furious vendor lagged behind, shaking his fists in the air. For Aladdin, every day was a new adventure on the streets of Agrabah, even if not always for the noblest of reasons. At the same moment, inside the majestic palace that towered over the city like a glittering jewel, Princess Jasmine watched the horizon from her golden balcony. Her long black hair danced in the brief desert breeze, while her pet tiger, Raja, rested lazily at her feet. The princess sighed, bored with the walls that imprisoned her and the rules that dictated her life. "Another suitor today, Raja," she murmured, stroking the tiger's head. "Another arrogant prince who only sees a crown, not a person." The animal growled in sympathy. The laws of the kingdom were clear. Jasmine had to marry a prince before her next birthday, which was fast approaching. Meanwhile, in the depths of the palace, Grand Vizier Jafar was plodding in his gloomy office. Tall and slender, with his black and red robes and snake-shaped staff. He was the embodiment of ambition. Next to him, Iago, his sarcastic red parrot, watched as the vizier consulted ancient scrolls. "The lamp must be somewhere, Iago," Jafar muttered, his black eyes shining with malice. "And when I find it, not even the Sultan can stand in the way of my destiny to rule Agrabah." His obsession with the legendary magic lamp grew by the day, as did his plans to usurp the throne. Back on the streets, Aladdin finally reached his refuge, an abandoned building at the top of the city with a privileged view of the palace. Sharing his bread with Abu, he watched the sun set over the golden domes. "Look at that, Abu," he said, pointing to the palace. "People with so much, while others have so little." The monkey nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "One day, friend, things will be different. One day we'll live in a palace, have servants and treasures." His reverie was interrupted by a commotion in the streets below. A new prince was arriving to woo the princess, his extravagant entourage pushing people out of the way. Aladdin watched with disgust at the display of arrogance. The next day, Aladdin was again in the market streets when he saw something that would change his life forever. A little girl was crying after a cruel shopkeeper snatched an apple from her hands. Without thinking twice, Aladdin grabbed an apple from another stall and handed it to the little girl, who smiled gratefully before running off. It was at that moment that he saw her, a young woman of extraordinary beauty, watching the scene with approval. Jasmine had escaped from the palace, disguised in simple clothes, determined to experience life beyond the royal walls. Their gazes met, and something inexplicable passed between them. Before Aladdin could approach, palace guards appeared, searching for the missing princess. In the ensuing confusion, a mysterious old man approached Aladdin, whispering about a magical cave in the desert and a treasure that could change his life. "Only someone with a pure heart can enter the Cave of Wonders," said the old man, who was actually Jafar in disguise. "Someone like you, young man." Aladdin, still thinking about the mysterious market girl and dreaming of a better life, didn't notice the malice in the old man's eyes. He accepted the proposal, unaware that he was about to be involved in an adventure far greater than he could have imagined. That night, as the moon illuminated the desert dunes, Aladdin and Abu followed the mysterious old man out of the city. The Cave of Wonders appeared out of the sand like an apparition, the head of an enormous tiger with eyes as bright as rubies. "Remember," warned the old man, "bring me only the lamp. All the rest of the treasure you find will be yours." His words were honey, but they hid poison. Aladdin looked at Abu, who was clinging nervously to his shoulder. "Well, friend, what could possibly go wrong?" He smiled, trying to hide his own apprehension. With a determined step, he crossed the fangs of the cave, descending into the mysterious depths that would change his fate forever. What he didn't know was that that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would test not only his courage, but also his character. A story where he would discover that true riches don't always shine the brightest, and that love can be found in the most unexpected places. Meanwhile, above the city, Princess Jasmine was also thinking about the kind young man she had met in the market, without imagining that their paths were about to cross in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. The darkness of the Cave of Wonders engulfed Aladdin and Abu as they descended a long stone staircase. The young man held a torch that the mysterious old man had given him, its dancing flames casting sinister shadows on the ancient walls. Abu clung tightly to his friend's shoulder, his small eyes wide with apprehension. "Calm down, Abu," whispered Aladdin, trying to sound more confident than he really felt. "Think of all the treasures we could find down here. We'll never have to steal to eat again." As they advanced, the cave opened up into a gigantic chamber that took Aladdin's breath away. Mountains of gold, jewels, and precious artifacts stretched as far as the eye could see, shining like earthly stars in the light of his torch. Abu immediately jumped off Aladdin's shoulder, mesmerized by an enormous ruby the size of an orange. "Abu no," Aladdin warned, remembering the old man's warning. "We can only touch the lamp, remember?" The monkey pouted, but reluctantly moved away from the tempting jewel. As they crossed the sea of riches, Aladdin couldn't help thinking about the girl in the market. With all that wealth, perhaps he could impress her, offer her a life of comfort and luxury. His thoughts were interrupted when something caught his eye, an ornate carpet floating a few centimeters above the ground. Abu, do you see that? Aladdin rubbed his eyes in disbelief. The carpet, realizing it had been noticed, waved one of its tassels as if greeting the visitors. It's a flying carpet, a magic carpet. The carpet approached gracefully, making a theatrical bow that drew laughter from Aladdin. Abu, initially frightened, soon found himself fascinated by his new magical companion. The carpet began to make animated gestures, as if it wanted to show them something. "Do you know where the lamp is?" asked Aladdin. The carpet nodded vigorously and began to float towards a distant staircase. "Good. Show me the way, friend." Outside the cave, Jafar maintained his elder disguise, but his patience was beginning to wear thin. "That brat is taking too long," he grumbled to Iago, who was hiding in his robes. "The lamp should be in my hands before dawn." Back inside the cave, Aladdin, Abu, and their new magical friend reached an isolated chamber. In the center, on a high stone pedestal, rested an old, unadorned bronze lamp. Mysterious rays of light converged on it, as if the whole place had been built to protect this simple object. "All this way, for that old lamp," Aladdin commented, carefully climbing the steps of the pedestal. Abu made a sound of disappointment, clearly more interested in the treasures they had left behind. When Aladdin finally picked up the lamp, a strange sensation ran through his body, as if he were holding something alive and pulsating. Before he could examine his discovery further, a high-pitched scream echoed through the chamber. Abu had succumbed to temptation and grabbed a huge red jewel. The ground began to shake violently, and a thunderous voice reverberated throughout the cave. "You have perverted the forbidden treasure. Now you will suffer the consequences." "Abu, what have you done?" Aladdin shouted, as the walls began to crumble and bubbling lava gushed out of the ground. The flying carpet quickly glided towards them, offering an escape route. The desperate escape through the collapsing cave was a blur of movement and chaos. The carpet zigzagged between collapsing pillars and jets of lava, while Aladdin clung tightly to the lamp with one hand and Abu with the other. Behind them, a veritable tsunami of treasure and destruction was chasing them. "I can see the way out," Aladdin shouted hopefully, spotting moonlight through the cave's fangs. However, a giant rock came crashing down on the carpet, throwing them into a wall. Aladdin managed to cling to a rocky ledge, but was rapidly losing strength. Up above, the old man held out his wrinkled hand. "Quickly, young man, give me the lamp, and I'll pull you up. Hang on, Abu," Aladdin shouted, trying to reach the outstretched hand while protecting his furry friend. With a lot of effort, he managed to hand the lamp to the old man, who immediately changed his worried expression to one of evil triumph. "Finally," Jafar exclaimed, his voice returning to normal as he ripped off his disguise. "After all these years, you," Aladdin gasped, recognizing the dreaded vizier of the palace. Before he could react, Jafar stepped on his toes with force. "Your reward for your services," he laughed cruelly, watching Aladdin and Abu plummet into the darkness of the collapsing cave. The flying carpet dived after them, tried to catch up, but it was too late. The last thing Aladdin saw before losing consciousness was Jafar's triumphant face disappearing as the cave entrance closed forever, sealing them in the dark depths. Hours passed before Aladdin regained consciousness. He was lying in a small natural cave, dimly lit by phosphorescent crystals on the walls. Abu and the flying carpet were beside him, the monkey anxiously trying to wake him up. "I'm fine, Abu," Aladdin groaned, slowly sitting up. "But we're stuck down here." His gaze wandered around the cave until he noticed something glowing in a corner. The lamp. Apparently, during the confusion, Abu had managed to steal it back from Jafar. "You're amazing, you know that?" Aladdin laughed, hugging his little friend. Picking up the lamp, he noticed an almost faded inscription on its surface. "There's something written here, but it's very dirty." He began to rub the lamp with the sleeve of his robe, without imagining that this simple gesture was about to change his life forever. The lamp began to shake in his hands, emanating a bright blue light. Colored smoke poured out of the nozzle, filling the small cave as a powerful, jovial voice echoed. A year, 10,000 years can give you quite a cake. The blue smoke gradually solidified into the shape of a colossal, imposing figure with bright blue skin and a small black tuft on his head. The genius, as he introduced himself with a theatrical bow, filled the small cave with his magnetic presence and exuberant personality. Wow, 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 look who we have here, the genie exclaimed, materializing several spotlights that illuminated Aladdin. My new master, allow me to introduce myself properly. With a snap of his fingers, a lively tune began to play out of nowhere as the genie multiplied into several versions of himself, each with a different instrument. Aladdin and Abu watched in amazement as the genie performed a musical number explaining the rules of the 3 wishes. Rule number 1, I can't kill anyone. Rule number 2, I can't make anyone fall in love. And rule number 3, I can't bring anyone back from the dead. Other than that, just ask. 3 wishes? Aladdin asked, still trying to process the surreal situation. Anything? Well, there are some limitations, as I mentioned in the song, which by the way was sensational, don't you think? The genie winked, prompting a small audience of applause. But yes, practically anything. Riches, fame, power. Although I'd always suggest starting with getting out of this cave, considering the circumstances. Aladdin smiled cunningly. What if I don't use a wish to get out of here? What if you take us out of the goodness of your heart? The genie was momentarily speechless before bursting into laughter. Ah, that's clever. It's been a long time since I've met a master with a sense of humor. But okay, you win, kid. I'll get you out of here for free, as a courtesy to the house. With one dramatic movement, the genie transformed into a rocket, grabbed Aladdin, Abu, and the carpet, and shot through the ceiling of the cave, punching through layers and layers of rock until they emerged in an oasis in the middle of the desert, under the starry sky. And here we are, announced the genie, returning to his original form. Now about those 3 wishes. Aladdin sat on the edge of a small pond, thinking deeply. The image of the mysterious market girl, who he still didn't know was Princess Jasmine, danced in his mind. Genie, have you ever fallen in love? The question took the magical being by surprise. His usually playful expression softened. Well, in 10,000 years you end up seeing a lot of love pass by. But personally, let's just say it's hard to maintain a relationship when you live in a lamp. There's this girl, Aladdin began, and the genie immediately transformed into a therapist with glasses and a notepad. She's amazing, but she's a princess, and the law says she can only marry a prince. Ah, the classic forbidden love dilemma, Genie exclaimed dramatically. You know, there's a very obvious solution to that. He snapped his fingers, and suddenly Aladdin found himself dressed in luxurious royal clothes. Can you turn me into a prince? Aladdin's eyes lit up at the possibility. I can turn you into anything you want, boy. Prince, king, emperor, even a movie critic, although I wouldn't recommend the last option. The genie joked, making royal poses. Aladdin stood up, excited. So, genie, I wish you to turn me into the richest and most powerful Prince Agrabah has ever seen. Your wishes are my orders, master. With a grand gesture, the genie began to weave his magic. Rays of colored light enveloped Aladdin, transforming his shabby clothes into a white and gold costume worthy of royalty. Abu was transformed into an elegant elephant, while magical fireworks exploded in the night sky. Presenting, announced the genie in an announcer's voice, His Royal Highness, Prince Ali Ababwa. Meanwhile, in the palace, Jafar was furious. His frantic search for the lamp in his chambers had yielded no results. That miserable monkey must have stolen it, he vociferated, knocking objects off his desk. Maybe it's time to change tack, suggested Iago, his parrot. The princess still has to get married before the next sunset. Jafar's eyes twinkled with mischief. Yes, perhaps it's time to convince the Sultan to see things my way. His snake-shaped staff began to glow ominously. The next morning, Agrabah awoke to an unprecedented spectacle. A grand procession was crossing the city streets, led by a young prince on a majestic white elephant. Dancers, musicians, and servants handed out gold coins to the amazed populace. The genie, disguised as a royal advisor, enthusiastically coordinated the show, occasionally transforming himself into different people in the crowd to start chants of Prince Ali. Magnificent is he, Ali Ababwa. At the palace, Jasmine watched the procession from her balcony with disinterest. Just another arrogant prince, she sighed to Raja. However, there was something familiar about that young man that she couldn't quite identify. Aladdin, or Prince Ali, felt his heart racing as he approached the palace. Under all that luxury and pomp, he was still the same boy from the streets, dreaming of winning the heart of a princess. What he didn't know was that his journey of self-discovery had only just begun, and that the greatest lessons about love, honesty, and courage were yet to come. The big question on his mind was, how long could he keep up the charade? And more importantly, when the truth came out, would his true self be enough to win not just a kingdom, but the heart of a princess? The great hall of the palace shone with sunlight through the colorful stained glass windows when Prince Ali was introduced to the Sultan. The chubby, good-natured ruler was immediately charmed by the young visitor, especially after Aladdin presented him with a golden mechanical watch that the genie had conjured up. "Extraordinary, simply extraordinary," exclaimed the Sultan, examining the gift with sparkling eyes. "You must know my daughter, Jasmine. She's not interested." Jasmine's firm voice echoed through the hall as she entered, her tiger Raja following her faithfully. Her eyes met Aladdin's, and for a moment, something familiar seemed to pass between them. Jafar watched the scene from the shadows, his fingers gripping his staff with increasing strength. "Just another insignificant prince," he muttered to Yardo. "But there's something about him that bothers me." Determined to impress the princess, Aladdin approached with an elegant bow. "Your Highness, I know you must be tired of suitors, but I ask only for a chance to prove myself." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the unusual humility in his words. "And how do you intend to do that, Prince Ali?" With a confident smile, Aladdin held out his hand. "How about a walk? I promise to show you a whole new perspective of Agrabah." The magic carpet was waiting on the palace balcony, disguised as an ordinary carpet. When Jasmine hesitantly accepted Aladdin's hand and climbed onto it, her eyes widened in surprise as she watched him gently levitate. "Trust me," whispered Aladdin, words that echoed a distant memory in Jasmine's mind. The carpet took off smoothly, carrying them beyond the palace walls. The city stretched out below them like a living map, the streets winding between the buildings like golden rivers under the setting sun. Jasmine couldn't contain her admiration, her fingers entwined firmly in Aladdin's. "It's incredible," she sighed as they flew over the rooftops where, unbeknownst to her, Aladdin used to sleep. "I've never seen Agrabah like this." As they flew, Aladdin began to show a surprisingly intimate knowledge of the city and its people. He pointed to a small square where children played, told stories about the market traders, and shared secrets that only someone who lived on the streets could know. "How do you know so much about the lives of ordinary people?" Jasmine asked, her curiosity growing. Aladdin hesitated, his heart torn between the truth and the need to maintain his charade. "I believe that a true leader must know all aspects of his kingdom, not just the palaces." As night fell, they landed on a distant rooftop, sharing a simple meal that genius had discreetly provided. The stars began to dot the dark sky, and conversation flowed naturally between them. "You know," said Jasmine, "you're different from the other princes. There's something about you that reminds me of..." She stopped, studying his face more closely. Aladdin's heart raced. "Reminds you of what?" "Someone I met at the market," she replied slowly. "A young man who helped a child in need." Before Aladdin could reply, an eerie glow caught his eye. In the palace, red lights emanated from the tower where Jafar's chambers were located. The vizier was busy with his own plot. "The staff is almost ready, Iago," Jafar muttered, adding ingredients to a bubbling cauldron. "Soon, its hypnotic power will be strong enough to control even the Sultan." Back on the roof, Jasmine and Aladdin shared a moment of contemplative silence. Ali, she finally said, sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in a life I didn't choose. Do you understand that? Aladdin felt the weight of his own lie. More than you know, he replied softly. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving. When they returned to the palace, something had changed between them. Jasmine no longer saw just a suitor, but someone who seemed to truly understand her. And Aladdin, despite the guilt growing in his chest, was more in love than ever. The genie, who watched discreetly as he became a star in the sky, sighed, "Ah, young love, so beautiful and so complicated." That night, as Aladdin walked through the palace gardens, lost in thought about Jasmine, a shadow moved in the darkness. Jafar emerged from the bushes, his staff glowing menacingly. "Impressive demonstration, Prince Ali," he said with false cordiality. Or should I say, Aladdin? Aladdin's blood ran cold in his veins. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but you do." Jafar smiled mischievously. "The street rat I found in the Cave of Wonders. I wonder what the princess would say if she knew the truth about her precious prince." Aladdin kept his composure, even though his heart was pounding frantically. "Your accusations are as empty as your loyalty to the Sultan." Jafar's smile only widened. "Be careful, boy. You're not the only one with secrets in this palace." With those words, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aladdin with an even heavier burden on his heart. In his makeshift room, Aladdin found the genie playing chess with himself. "Genie, what do I do? I can't keep lying to her." The genie paused his game, looking seriously at his friend. "The truth is a funny way of coming out, Al. The longer you wait, the more painful it will be." But before Aladdin could consider a confession, a guard rushed into his chambers. "Prince Ali, the Sultan requests your immediate presence in the throne room. It's about the princess." Aladdin's heart raced as he ran through the palace corridors. As he entered the throne room, he found a disturbing scene. The Sultan was in a trance, his glazed eyes fixed on the red glow of Jafar's staff. Jasmine was handcuffed, guards holding her tightly as she struggled. "Ah, Prince Ali, how nice of you to join us." Jafar smiled mischievously. "Or should I say, the street rat? Dad, wake up. Jafar is controlling you." Jasmine shouted, but the Sultan remained motionless. "The Sultan has seen the truth about his favorite suitor," Jafar proclaimed, his voice echoing through the hall. "A liar, a common thief who dared to pass himself off as royalty." "It's a lie." Aladdin advanced, but guards quickly surrounded him. Abu, still in elephant form, tried to help, but Jafar turned him back into a small monkey with a flick of his staff. "The magic!" Jasmine gasped, realizing. "So you're not really a prince?" The look of disappointment in Jasmine's eyes went through Aladdin like a dagger. "Jasmine, I can explain." "Guards," Jafar ordered, "take this impostor to the dungeons. The sentence for deceiving the royal family is death at dawn." As he was dragged away, Aladdin saw the genie floating invisibly near the ceiling, his expression anguished. He could use his second wish to escape, but that would mean leaving Jasmine and the kingdom in Jafar's hands. In the dungeons, chained to the cold wall, Aladdin finally let the weight of his lies fall on his shoulders. Abu snuggled up next to him, trying to comfort him. "I've ruined everything, Abu," he whispered. "I should have told you the truth from the start." A familiar blue glow filled the cell as the genie appeared. "It's not over yet, Al. You still have 2 wishes. What kind of person would I be if I used magic to solve my problems again?" Aladdin replied bitterly. "That's how this mess started. Sometimes, Al, the real magic isn't in the wishes, but in what we do with them," the genie said wisely. Just then, the magic carpet slid through the bars of the cell window, bringing with it a surprise. "Jasmine, you have 1 minute to explain everything to me," she said firmly, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and hope. "The truth is, I'm just Aladdin, a thief of the streets," he confessed, finally setting his heart free. "I found a magic lamp, and the genie turned me into a prince because I wanted to be worthy of you. But I realized too late that true nobility doesn't come from titles or wealth." "The boy from the market," Jasmine whispered, the pieces falling into place. "It was you all along." Before they could continue, they heard footsteps approaching. Jafar is using dark magic to control your father, Aladdin explained quickly. He wants the throne for himself. And I have proof. The genie appeared, transformed into a detective with a magnifying glass. That chatty parrot of his can't keep a secret. Jasmine nodded determinedly. We need to stop him. But how? I have a plan. Aladdin smiled, his old adventurous spirit returning. But it will require all of us to work together. In the throne room, Jafar savored his imminent triumph, forcing the hypnotized sultan to sign decrees that would make him the new ruler. Iago flew around in circles, humming about his future as a royal parrot. Suddenly, the doors opened. Jasmine walked in, seemingly submissive. You win, Jafar. I agree to marry you. Excellent choice, princess. Jafar smiled victoriously, not noticing the magic carpet gliding silently behind him. Meanwhile, Aladdin, freed by one of the genie's tricks, was sneaking around the pillars of the hole. The plan was simple: distract Jafar long enough to break his staff, the source of his hypnotic power. But before the wedding, Jasmine continued, approaching seductively. Wouldn't you like to see how you look with a crown? Jafar's ego couldn't resist the temptation. When he reached out to take the crown Jasmine offered, Aladdin jumped up, grabbing the staff. Jafar roared, his mask of sophistication falling away completely. In the ensuing struggle, the staff slipped out of both their hands, shattering as it hit the ground. A wave of magical energy swept through the hole, releasing the sultan from his trance. Guards, arrest the traitor, the sultan ordered, finally aware of Jafar's treachery. But Jafar had one last card. If I can't take the throne by cunning, I'll take it by force. He pulled out the lamp he had stolen from Aladdin during the confusion. Genie, my first wish. Make me the most powerful being in the world. Aladdin shouted, but it was too late. The genie, forced to obey, transformed Jafar into an all-powerful sorcerer. The vizier grew to the ceiling, his black robes turning into gloomy smoke. Now, let's see who the real ruler of Agrabah is. Jafar thundered, launching bolts of energy that turned everything they touched into black gold. In the midst of the chaos, Aladdin realized something crucial. Jasmine, he shouted over the roar of magic. Do you trust me? Their eyes met through the magical storm, and in that moment, all lies and disguises disappeared. I do, she replied. Then hold on tight. Aladdin whistled, and the magic carpet caught them in mid-flight, dodging Jafar's attacks as they executed the final part of the plan. Why are you running away from me? Jafar roared. I'm the most powerful being in the world. Almost that, Aladdin teased. The genie is even more powerful. He gave you your powers, and he can take them away. Jafar's eyes shone with understanding and greed. Yes, genie, my second wish. Make me an all-powerful genie. The genie covered his eyes, not wanting to see, but compelled to fulfill the wish. Jafar began to transform, his body growing and changing until he became a colossal red genie. The power, the absolute power. Jafar laughed, not noticing the black lamp that materialized at his feet, nor the golden chains that began to bind his wrists. You forgot something, Jafar, Aladdin shouted. Geniuses have a lot of power, but zero freedom. No, Jafar shouted when he realized the trap, being sucked into his own lamp along with Iago, would try to escape too late. With Jafar defeated, peace returned to the palace. The Sultan, impressed by Aladdin's bravery and intelligence, declared that the law was wrong. His daughter should have the right to marry whomever her heart chose. And now, Jasmine asked, entwining her fingers in Aladdin's. Now, he smiled, picking up the genie's lamp. There's one more thing I need to do. Turning to his blue friend, he declared, Genie, I wish you freedom. With a flash of light and the sound of chains breaking, the genie's bracelets fell off, and his smoke-shaped legs turned into real feet. For the first time in millennia, he was truly free. Ow, the genie smiled, tears in his eyes. You are a true prince, not by magic or title, but by your heart. And so, under the starry sky of Agrabah, Aladdin and Jasmine discovered that true love doesn't need disguises or magical wishes, just the courage to be who you really are. The rising sun tinted the hills of Rome golden as Tarquin the Sovereign gazed down on the city from the top of his palace. The seventh and last king of Rome had just completed his first year in power, following the controversial death of his predecessor Servius Tullius. The streets were already buzzing with the morning routine, but something in the air suggested that this would be no ordinary day. Lucius, his closest advisor and confidant, approached with hurried steps, his sandals echoing across the marble floor. "My king," he said, breathing heavily, "there is a woman at the gates. She's unlike anyone I've ever seen." Tarquin raised an eyebrow, more irritated than curious at the interruption. "How different, Lucius? Speak clearly." "Her eyes, my lord, seem to contain the age of the world. She carries 9 volumes in her arms and insists on speaking only to you." The guards tried to stop her, but Lucius hesitated. The weapons simply crumbled to dust when they touched her. The king adjusted his purple robe, a symbol of his power, and made a dismissive gesture. "Very well, bring her to me. Let's see what kind of tricks this woman has to show us." When the visitor entered the royal hall, the air seemed to thicken. She was neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor ugly. Her appearance changed subtly with every glance, like flowing water that never keeps the same shape. In her arms were 9 books bound in ancient leather, each emanating an aura of its own. "I am the Sibyl of Cougars." Her voice resounded through the hall as if coming from multiple directions. "And I carry with me the fate of Rome." Tarquin, used to intimidating his subjects with his imposing presence, felt strangely diminished. Even so, he maintained the authoritarian pose that characterized him. And why would a prophetess leave her cave to visit Rome? "Because Rome will be eternal," replied the Sibyl, "and its destiny is intertwined with the destiny of the world. In these 9 books are written all the prophecies that will guide your city through the centuries." The king laughed, more out of nervousness than amusement. "And I suppose you want to sell them to me?" "Yes," she replied simply, stating a price that made the king's eyes widen. "That's more gold than we spent building the Temple of Jupiter," protested Tarquin. "You must be mad." The Sibyl didn't reply. Instead, she walked over to the brazier heating the hall and, without hesitation, threw 3 of the books into the flames. The fire took on impossible colors, and a scent of ancient wisdom filled the room. "The price remains the same," she declared. "Now for 6 books." Tarquin felt his throat go dry. Lucius, next to him, visibly paled. The king, however, stood firm in his refusal. "It's still an absurd price." Again, without showing any emotion, the Sibyl threw 3 more volumes into the fire. The flames danced in hypnotic patterns, and whispers in forgotten languages echoed through the hall. "Same price," she said, "for the last 3 books." The hall plunged into a sepulchral silence. Tarquin looked at Lucius, who nodded discreetly. The advisor, known for his wisdom, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "My king," whispered Lucius, "think carefully. 6 volumes of prophecies have already been lost. If these last ones are also lost..." Tarquin felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. His ambition had led him to the throne of Rome, but now something greater was at stake. It wasn't just about power or wealth. It was about the fate of a city which, according to the mysterious woman in front of him, was destined for eternity. The books contained more than just predictions, the Sibyl continued, as if reading her thoughts. They are a guide to navigating the storms to come. Rome will face trials that will test its very existence. Without this wisdom, how will they know which way to go? The king realized that he was facing a historic crossroads. His actions at that moment would echo down the centuries, affecting not only his reign, but the fate of all Rome. "Very well," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of the decision. "I will pay the price." An enigmatic smile appeared on the Sibyl's face as she handed over the remaining 3 volumes. "You have chosen wisely, Tarquin. These books should be kept in the Temple of Jupiter, consulted only in times of extreme need. Choose your guardians well, for the power contained in these pages can save as well as destroy. With these words, the Sibyl began to leave the hall. Her form seemed to dissolve into the shadows, like morning mist under the rising sun. Before disappearing completely, her last words echoed through the air. The fate of Rome is now in your hands. Use it wisely. Tarquin stood there, holding the 3 volumes, feeling their weight not only physically, but also mystically. Lucius approached cautiously, looking at the books with a mixture of fascination and awe. "What shall we do now, my king?" "Now," replied Tarquin, his voice firm but laden with a new responsibility. "Now we begin to build the future of Rome." The next morning, Tarquin ordered the construction of a special chamber in the Temple of Jupiter to house the Sibylline books. As he watched the workers begin the work, his mind was still filled with the images of the previous day. The mystery of the Sibyl and the destruction of the 6 books haunted his thoughts. "We need to establish a select group of guardians," said Lucius, who stood beside him like a faithful shadow. "Men of unquestionable character, versed in the ancient languages and rituals." "Duumviri Sacrorum," murmured Tarquin, the name appearing in his mind like a divine inspiration. 2 men chosen from the noblest patrician families, who will dedicate their lives to protecting and interpreting the books. News of a Sibyl's visit had already spread throughout Rome, growing and changing with each new report. In the taverns and markets, people whispered about the mysterious woman who had appeared before the king, some saying that she had turned into a dove and flown away, others swearing that she had dissolved into a cloud of golden light. While the city buzzed with rumors, Tarquin faced an even more crucial decision: the choice of the first duumviri. After days of deliberation with his advisors, 2 names emerged: Marcus Attilius, a man known for his wisdom and devotion to the gods, and Gaius Veturius, a scholar respected for his knowledge of the ancient scriptures. On the day of the appointment ceremony, the Temple of Jupiter was packed with dignitaries and priests. The air was heavy with incense and expectation. Marco and Gaius, dressed in white togas embroidered with gold thread, knelt before the altar. "You have been chosen," Tarquin proclaimed, his voice echoing off the marble columns, "to be the first guardians of the Sibylline books. This is not only an honor, but a sacred responsibility. Failure in your duty will be punishable by death." The 2 men took their solemn oaths, their voices firm despite the weight of the words. Soon after the ceremony, they were led into the newly built chamber, where the 3 books were waiting, emanating an aura of ancient power. Marco was the first to touch one of the volumes, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the yellowed pages. The characters seemed to dance before his eyes, alternating between known and unknown languages. "It's extraordinary," he whispered. "The words, they change according to the reader's needs." Caio, examining another volume, nodded in agreement. "It's as if the gods themselves had written these pages. Each prophecy seems to have multiple layers of meaning." Over the next few days, the 2 men immersed themselves in studying the sacred texts, establishing rituals and protocols for their consultation. They determined that the books should only be opened in times of extreme need, when Rome faced dangers that threatened its very existence. Tarquin watched everything with a mixture of pride and apprehension. There were times when he wondered if he had made the right choice in accepting the Sibyl's price. But then he remembered the look in her eyes, that supernatural certainty that Rome was destined for greatness. One afternoon, while he was supervising the final work in the book chamber, Lucius approached with disturbing news. "My king, there are rumors that some senators are questioning the authenticity of the books. They say you've been duped by a charlatan." The king laughed, a humorless sound. "What the taught, Lucius? When the first crisis comes, when we need the wisdom contained in these pages, they'll understand." As if to prove his words, that very night a tremor shook Rome. It was no ordinary earthquake. There was something supernatural in its nature. The sky took on a sickly greenish hue, and reports of strange omens began to arrive from all parts of the city. Marco and Caio were hastily summoned. Under the light of torches, they opened the first volume of the Sibylline books. The pages seemed to pulsate with a life of their own as the two men deciphered the ancient prophecies. "It's a warning," declared Marco, his voice trembling slightly. "The gods are displeased. A ritual has been neglected, a temple desecrated." Gaius continued reading, his fingers tracing the lines of the text. "Here, it speaks of a necessary sacrifice. A specific offering must be made to the god Vulcan to appease his wrath." Tarquin immediately ordered the rituals to be carried out according to the instructions in the books. For 3 days and nights, sacrifices were offered, prayers were chanted, and gradually the threatening signs began to diminish. The sky cleared, the tremors ceased, and a supernatural peace descended on Rome. This first test of the wisdom of the Sibylline books served to establish their authority definitively. The same senators who had doubted before now bowed in reverence before the sacred chamber. The position of the Duumviri was elevated to a new level of respect and influence. Mark and Gaius continued their meticulous work of study and preservation, aware that every word contained in the volumes could one day be the difference between the salvation and destruction of Rome. They established a system of controlled copies, ensuring that knowledge would not be lost even if something happened to the originals. Tarquin, for his part, began to see his own position in a new light. He wasn't just the king of Rome. He was the guardian of a divine legacy, the man who had granted the city access to the wisdom of the gods through the Sibylline books. At night, alone in his chambers, he often found himself thinking about the 6 lost books, wondering what precious knowledge had turned to ashes that fateful morning. But then he remembered the Sibyl's words. "The fate of Rome is now in your hands." And he knew that, somehow, the 3 books that remained were exactly what Rome needed. The years that followed brought a new era of prosperity for Rome. The wisdom of the Sibylline books, under the watchful eye of the Duumviri, proved invaluable at several critical moments. Mark and Gaius had established a rigorous routine of study and meditation, dedicating their lives to understanding the sacred texts. One particularly cold morning, while fog still covered the 7 hills of Rome, a messenger arrived panting at the royal palace. A mysterious illness was spreading through the city's poorest neighborhoods, causing extremely high fevers and delirium in those affected. The doctors were perplexed, as no known treatment seemed to work. "We need to consult the books," declared Tarquin, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already witnessed the power of the prophecies. Lucius, now with gray hairs at his temples, nodded in agreement. In the sacred chamber, Marco and Gaius were already poring over the volumes when the king arrived. The pages gave off a faint glow in the torchlight, and the air was heavy with the scent of burnt herbs that the guardians used in their protection rituals. "We found something," said Marco, his finger tracing invisible lines in the air as he read. "The disease is not natural. It's a punishment from Apollo, sent because an ancient sacred grove was desecrated during the city's latest expansions." Gaius added, "The books speak of a purification ritual that must be carried out at sunrise. We'll need 9 Vestal virgins, water from the sacred spring, and laurel branches picked at midnight." The ritual was prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The Vestals, in their immaculate white robes, formed a perfect circle on the spot where the sacred grove had been destroyed. When the first rays of sunlight touched the city, their voices rose in an ancient chant, words in a language that few still understood. The cure wasn't immediate, but in the days that followed, the sick began to recover. The fever subsided, the delirium ceased, and a sense of spiritual renewal pervaded all of Rome. The success of the ritual only further solidified the importance of the Sibylline books and their keepers. However, it wasn't all victory. One night, during a particularly violent storm, lightning struck one of the towers of the Temple of Jupiter, very close to the chamber of the books. The ensuing fire threatened to destroy the sacred texts, and it was only thanks to the quick action of Marcus and Gaius that the volumes were saved. This incident led to an important decision. New guardians had to be trained to ensure the continuity of sacred knowledge. After careful consideration, 2 young patricians were chosen as apprentices, Lucius Petilius and Titus Mantius. Training the new guardians proved to be a complex task. It wasn't just a question of learning to read the texts. The young men needed to develop a special sensitivity to interpret the multiple layers of meaning contained in the prophecies. The books don't reveal their secrets easily, Marco explained to his apprentices. Sometimes a single word can have 3 or 4 different interpretations, and choosing the wrong one can have disastrous consequences. During this period of transition, Rome faced a series of small crises that tested both the veteran guardians and their apprentices. There were signs in the sky that had to be interpreted, omens and sacrifices that demanded special attention, and even a brief period of drought that was resolved through specific rituals described in the books. Tarquin observed all this with growing satisfaction. His decision to buy the books of the Sibyl, even at such a high price, had proved to be one of the most important acts of his reign. However, in his moments of solitude, he was still haunted by the memory of the 6 burned volumes. One evening, while walking through the palace gardens, the king found Lucius gazing at the stars. "Sometimes I wonder," said the advisor, "if the burned books contained warnings about events yet to come, dangers against which we cannot now prepare ourselves." Tarquin considered the words for a moment before replying. "The Sibyl didn't do it by chance, my friend. Perhaps the 3 books we have left are exactly what we need. No more, no less." The wisdom contained in the Sibylline books began to influence not only religious decisions, but also practical aspects of the city's administration. Consultation of the sacred texts preceded important military decisions, the construction of new temples, and even the choice of dates for public celebrations. Mark and Gaius, realizing the growing responsibility that weighed on their shoulders, devoted themselves even more arduously to training their successors. They knew that the future of Rome depended on preserving not only the physical books, but also the tradition of interpretation that was being built. "The books are like a deep river," Gaius would tell his apprentices. "The surface may appear calm, but in the depths run powerful currents that can both nourish and destroy. Our task is to learn to swim in these waters without drowning in their mysteries." As the years went by, the influence of the Sibylline books grew deeper and deeper in Roman life. The apprentices Lucius Petilius and Titus Mullius progressed in their studies, absorbing not only the technical knowledge of the prophecies, but also the spiritual sensitivity necessary for their interpretation. One afternoon, while they were studying a particularly enigmatic passage, a tremor unlike any other ever felt shook Rome. It wasn't like the previous tremor they had experienced. This one seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, accompanied by a low, prolonged sound that made the citizens shudder with fear. In the center of the city, a fissure opened up in the ground, growing larger by the hour. Panic began to spread as reports came in that poisonous fumes were emerging from the opening, killing birds flying too close and causing the surrounding plants to wither. Marco and Gaius immediately gathered in the sacred chamber, along with their apprentices. It was the first major crisis they would face together, a crucial test for the new generation of guardians. The pages of the books seemed more alive than ever, the letters pulsing with a supernatural urgency. Here, pointing out Tito Manlio, his finger trembling slightly over a page, the prophecy speaks of a portal to the underworld that will open when Rome is at its proudest. Lucius Petilius continued reading, and it says that only the city's most precious sacrifice will be able to seal the opening and prevent the forces of the underworld from contaminating the world of the living. The news quickly reached Tarquin, who called an emergency council. While they discussed the meaning of the most precious sacrifice, the crack continued to grow, and a greenish mist began to spread through the nearby streets. It was then that Marcus Curtius, a young Roman knight known for his bravery and nobility, voluntarily presented himself before the council. "The most precious thing Rome has," he declared, "is not gold, nor jewels, nor temples. It's its young warriors willing to die for the city." Before anyone could stop him, Curtius mounted his most valuable horse, donned his shiniest armor, and in front of a stunned crowd, rode straight into the fissure. The sound of hose beating against stone echoed for a moment, followed by a sepulchral silence. Then, with a deafening boom, the earth began to close in, sealing the young warrior's sacrifice. This event profoundly marked not only the city, but also the way in which the Sibylline books were viewed. The place where the rift closed was consecrated and became known as Lake Cocius, in memory of the brave knight. For the apprentices, it was a powerful lesson in the weight of their responsibilities. Prophecies are not always clear, explained Gaius, but their consequences are always real and often irreversible. Marco, observing the development of his pupils, noticed a significant change in their attitudes. They finally understand, he commented to his companion, that we are not just scholars or priests. We are guardians of Rome's destiny. The atmosphere in the sacred chamber changed subtly after these events. The four men developed an even more rigorous routine of study and meditation. They began to create an elaborate system of notes and commentaries, recording not only the interpretations of the prophecies, but also the signs and omens that accompanied them. Tarquin, aged but still perceptive, realized that it was time to further institutionalize the role of the guardians. By his order, it was established that the duumviri would have a status equivalent to the highest priests in Rome, with the right to participate in all the important decisions of the state. The books are not just a spiritual guide, declared the king at a session of the Senate. They are the very anchor that keeps Rome connected to the gods. Each prophecy deciphered is a thread in the fabric of our city's destiny. As news of Cocius' sacrifice spread, pilgrims began arriving from all over Italy, eager to pay their respects at the spot where the young knight had given himself to save Rome. Many brought offerings and sought the wisdom of the guardians of the books. One day, while overseeing the cataloging of some minor prophecies, Lucius Petilius made an intriguing discovery. "Masters," he called out, his voice trembling with excitement, "I found something about the books." Marco and Gaius quickly approached, followed by Tito Mantilius. In the text, there was a cryptic reference that suggested that the knowledge of the lost volumes was not completely lost. Somehow, echoes of their prophecies were interwoven in the three remaining books. It's as if the books were a living organism, observed Tito, adapting and preserving the most essential knowledge, even after the destruction of part of its whole. This discovery led to a new phase of study, with the guardians looking for patterns and connections that had previously gone unnoticed. They began to realize that some prophecies seemed to change subtly over time, revealing new layers of meaning as circumstances changed. The discovery of the echoes of the burnt books in the remaining pages brought a new dimension to the guardians' work. Marco and Caio, now with gray hair and weathered faces, watched with satisfaction as their apprentices became worthy successors to their sacred legacy. One morning, as the first snow of winter covered Rome with its white mantle, a dark omen appeared in the skies. 3 eagles, symbols of Jupiter, were seen fighting over the temple, their feathers falling like rain on the sacred steps. The augurs interpreted the sign as a warning of great change to come. Lucius Petilius and Titus Mantius, now fully trained, immediately began consulting the Sibylline books. The pages seemed heavier than usual, as if fate itself were pressing against the ancient parchment. After hours of intense study, a prophecy emerged, clearer and more direct than usual. When pride becomes tyranny, when power corrupts justice, Rome will abandon its kings to embrace a new destiny. The prophecy caused quite a stir among the guardians. It was the first time the books had spoken so explicitly about a political change. Mark and Gaius knew that they had to report the discovery to the king, but they also understood the danger that such a revelation could bring. When Tarquin received the news, he reacted with a mixture of anger and fear. His last years in power had been marked by growing authoritarianism, and rumors of discontent were already circulating among the patrician families. The prophecy seemed to confirm his worst fears. "Perhaps there is an error in the interpretation," suggested the king, his voice betraying his anxiety. "Consult the books again. There must be a way to avoid this fate." But the guardians knew that the prophecies in the Sibylline books were not warnings that could be ignored or altered. They were glimpses into the fabric of fate, as inevitable as the sunrise. In the days that followed, more signs began to appear. Crows nesting in the royal palace, statues of the gods weeping blood, thunder on clear days. The tension in the city grew by the day. Tarquin's son, Sixtus, committed a terrible act against Lucrezia, a Roman noblewoman, triggering a series of events that would lead to the popular revolt led by Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquin Collatine. In the midst of the ensuing chaos, the guardians of the books faced their greatest challenge, preserving the sacred text during the political transition. While the angry mob marched against the royal palace, Marco and Gaius organized a secret operation to transfer the books to a safe place. The books do not belong to any king or form of government, Marco declared to his apprentices. They belong to Rome, and our duty is to protect them for future generations. During a moonless night, the four guardians, aided by a small group of Vestals, transported the sacred volumes through underground tunnels to a secret sanctuary in the depths of the Temple of Vesta. The site had been prepared weeks before, when the first signs of the revolution began to appear. The fall of the monarchy was swift and decisive. Tarquin and his family were expelled from Rome, marking the end of the Age of Kings and the beginning of the Republic. In the midst of the political transformation, a new order needed to be established for the safekeeping of the Sibylline books. The newly formed Roman Senate, recognizing the importance of the sacred texts, expanded the number of guardians from 2 to 10, creating the Decembrii Sacris Faciundis. This expansion reflected not only the need for greater protection for the books, but also the new political structure of the Republic, which was more inclusive and representative. Marco and Gaius, although already elderly, oversaw the transition and the training of the new guardians. Their last lessons to their successors were full of wisdom accumulated over decades of service. "The books are like Rome," said Marco in his final speech, "eternal, but constantly changing. Each generation must learn to interpret them according to its time, but always maintaining the sacred essence of their purpose." The prophecy about the end of the monarchy had been fulfilled, but the guardians knew it was just one of thousands contained in the ancient volumes. The pages continued to pulsate with a life of their own, holding secrets and revelations that would guide Rome through the centuries to come. Years later, when the Republic was firmly established, it was discovered that the Sibyl had predicted not only the fall of the kings, but also the greatness that Rome would achieve under its new form of government. The 3 books that remain proved sufficient to guide the city through its transformations, confirming the mysterious wisdom behind the prophetess' actions. The Sibylline books continued to be consulted at the most critical moments in Roman history, their prophecies echoing through the centuries like a golden thread weaving the fate of the eternal city. And so Tarquin's decision to buy the last 3 volumes, although it indirectly contributed to his own downfall, ensured the survival and greatness of Rome far beyond his reign. The story of the Books of Destiny has become a living legend, passed down from generation to generation, reminding everyone that true power lies not in political authority, but in the ancient wisdom that guides the steps of humanity through the ages. Winter had set in with unprecedented cruelty in that small village on the edge of the forest. The snow covered the roofs of the wooden houses like a heavy white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the lament of those struggling to survive. In one of these houses, the most modest of all, lived a family that, like so many others, was facing terribly difficult times. Joao, a 12-year-old boy with curious eyes and brown hair that was always tousled, shared a small room in the attic with his sister Maria, a 10-year-old girl who, despite her young age, already showed wisdom beyond her years. Their days were filled with little adventures around the house, always together, as if they were each other's shadow. The children's father, a lumberjack with calloused hands and a constantly worried expression, spent his days in the forest, trying to make a living from it, which was becoming increasingly scarce. His second wife, a thin woman with a stern look on her face, had joined the family only 2 years ago, after the children's mother died during a particularly cruel winter. Meals, which used to be moments of joy and communion, became silent and tense. The bread, increasingly hard and scarce, was divided into smaller and smaller portions. John and Mary could see the growing despair in the eyes of their father, who could barely look at his children during meals. as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. One particularly cold night, when the children should have been asleep, altered voices from downstairs caught their attention. John and Mary, driven by curiosity and fear, quietly descended the attic stairs, taking a seat on the top step where they could hear the conversation without being noticed. "There is no other choice," said the stepmother, her voice a whisper full of determination. "We can't feed 4 mouths. We can barely feed ourselves. If we carry on like this, we'll all starve to death." The father protested weakly, his voice laced with anguish. "They're my children. I can't just... Tomorrow, you'll take them to the deepest part of the forest," she continued, ignoring his protests. "Leave them there. Nature will decide their fate. It's cruel, yes, but it's even crueler to watch them all slowly starve to death." John felt Maria tremble beside him and held her hand tightly. In the darkness of the stairwell, the silent tears of the siblings mingled with the muffled sobs of their father, who finally gave in to the terrible plan. That night, while his sister slept a restless sleep, John stayed awake, his young brain working furiously in search of a solution. The full moon illuminated the room through the small attic window, and it was its glow that gave him an idea. He got up quietly and, picking up a piece of hard bread he had saved from his last meal, began to reduce it to crumbs. The next morning, when their father called them for a walk in the woods, John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. In his pockets, John carried the crumbs that would be his salvation. Maria, who had always been the more observant of the two, memorized every detail of the path, every peculiar tree, every stone that could serve as a reference. The forest swallowed them deeper and deeper. The father, walking ahead, occasionally wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his worn shirt. John discreetly dropped the breadcrumbs, creating a trail that would guide them back home. Maria squeezed her brother's hand tightly, finding courage in each other's presence. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a small clearing. The father, in a trembling voice, asked the children to wait there while he searched for firewood nearby. "Don't go anywhere," were his last words before disappearing into the trees, leaving his children alone in the cold, green immensity of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. John and Mary stood still, listening to the sounds of the forest intensifying around them. The wind whispered among the leaves, birds sang somewhere far away, and small animals ran across the ground covered in dry leaves. "He's not coming back, is he?" whispered Maria, her voice small and frightened. John hugged his sister, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "Don't worry," he said. "I've left a trail of crumbs. When it gets dark, we'll be able to follow you back home." But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a terrible discovery awaited them. Searching for the start of the trail of crumbs, they found only a few bird feathers and no sign of the path they had marked. The birds of the forest, hungry as all get out in that cruel winter, had devoured their only chance of return. Darkness began to approach, bringing with it an even more intense chill and even more threatening sounds. John and Mary, now truly lost in the forest, clung to each other, seeking warmth and comfort. Fear was beginning to settle in their hearts, but along with it, a fierce determination to survive, to find a way, to stay together against all the odds the forest could throw at them. What they didn't know was that their journey had only just begun, and that the dangers of the forest would only be the first of many challenges they would have to face. In the growing darkness, something was watching them, something that had long been waiting for visitors like them, something that would make their quest for survival even more desperate than they could have imagined. Night was rapidly advancing over the forest, bringing with it ever-lengthening and threatening shadows. John and Mary, still hugging each other to protect themselves from the biting cold, began to look for a safe place to spend the night. The boy, trying to keep his composure for the sake of his little sister, scoured the surroundings in search of some natural shelter. "There," exclaimed Maria, pointing to a large fallen tree whose exposed roots formed a kind of natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the icy wind that was starting to blow harder. The brothers settled into the small space, using dry leaves to create an insulating layer between them and the damp ground. Hunger was beginning to set in, painfully reminding them of why they had been abandoned. John searched his pockets, finding just a few crumbs left over from the bread he had used to mark the way. He carefully shared them with Mary, although they were barely enough to full his stomach. "John," whispered Maria, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think there are wolves in this forest?" Before John could answer, a distant howl cut through the night air, making them both shrink even further into their makeshift shelter. The boy hugged his sister tighter, feeling his own heart racing. "Don't worry," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They don't usually get close to people." The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest, once just a backdrop to their little daytime adventures, now seemed amplified and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every twig snapping under the weight of some nocturnal animal, startled the siblings. Maria eventually fell asleep in her brother's arms, exhausted by the day's walk and the emotional stress. John, however, stayed awake, determined to protect his sister. He watched the dancing shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees, trying to distinguish real threats from tricks played on his increasingly fertile imagination. With the first ray of sunshine, the siblings woke up completely chilled and even hungrier. Their stomachs rumbled painfully, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. Leaving their night shelter, they started walking in no particular direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization or at least something edible. "Look," exclaimed John, pointing to a bush laden with small red berries. Maria, however, grabbed his arm before he could reach them. "Wait," she said firmly. "Remember what Mom taught us? Some berries are poisonous." John stepped back, grateful for his sister's caution. His mother had indeed warned them about the dangers of the forest before she died. They continued walking, now more attentive to their surroundings, looking for signs of the fruits and mushrooms that their mother had taught them were safe to eat. The hours dragged by, and the hunger became harder and harder to bear. The sun was already high in the sky when a sweet, irresistible aroma reached them, making their stomachs growl even louder. It was a smell unlike anything they had ever smelled in the forest. Sweet, inviting, almost magical. "Can you smell it?" asked Maria, her nose moving like that of a small rabbit sniffing the air. John nodded, already moving in the direction of the tantalizing aroma. The siblings began to follow the scent, their tired legs finding new energy in the promise of food. As they advanced, the scent grew stronger, and something began to glow among the trees ahead. Pushing aside some low branches, John and Mary emerged into a small clearing and stood paralyzed at the most extraordinary sight they had ever witnessed. There, as if straight out of a dream, was a house, but it was no ordinary house. It was a building made entirely of sweets. The walls were made of gingerbread, decorated with colored candies and icing. The roof was covered in chocolate tiles, and the windows were made of crystallized sugar that sparkled in the sunlight. A path of different colored stones led to the door, and as they got closer, they realized that they were made of drops and hard candies. "This can't be real," muttered Maria, rubbing her eyes as if she expected the vision to disappear. John approached cautiously and touched one of the walls. His fingers sank lightly into the soft honey bread, and he brought a small piece to his mouth. The taste was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. "It's real," he exclaimed, already plucking another, larger piece from the wall. "Maria, it's all real food." The hunger that tormented them overcame any vestige of caution. The brothers began to devour pieces of the house, alternating between the gingerbread on the walls and the colorful candies that decorated them. The taste was so wonderful, so beyond their expectations, that for a moment they completely forgot their fear and exhaustion. They were so engrossed in their impromptu feast that they didn't notice when the door to the house opened silently. A figure watched them from the threshold, a strange smile forming on its wrinkled face. It was only when a sweet, melodious voice cut through the air that the children realized they were no longer alone. "Well, well," said the voice, making John and Mary freeze in place, their mouths still full of sweets. "What lovely little visitors I have today." The person at the door was a kind-looking lady, dressed in colorful clothes and an immaculate white apron. Her eyes, however, had a strange glint that made John instinctively take a step in front of his sister. "Poor things, you must be starving," the lady continued, opening the door wider in an inviting gesture. "Why don't you come in? I've got lots more goodies inside, and you look like you could use a nice hot dinner." John and Mary looked at each other, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hunger that had not yet been completely satisfied by the sweets in the house. The lady continued to smile, patiently, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for their decision. What the brothers couldn't know was that, behind that kind smile and the promise of more treats, lurked a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far in the forest. The candy house was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but also their cunning and, above all, the bond that united them as brothers. The lady stepped forward, and the light coming from inside the house created strange shadows on her wrinkled face. John squeezed Maria's hand, feeling his sister tremble slightly. Hunger, however, spoke louder than fear, and the delicious aroma coming from inside the house was simply irresistible. "Come, come," urged the lady, her voice as sweet as the honey that decorated the walls. "A nice hot soup will do you a lot of good. You're so skinny." With hesitation, the children followed the old woman into the house. The inside was even more impressive than the outside. Candied sugar furniture gleamed under the light of scented candles, and curtains made of caramel threads waved gently. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, covered with a tablecloth that seemed to be woven from cotton candy. Sit down," said the lady, indicating 2 stools next to the table. "I'm going to prepare something special for you." As she moved around the kitchen, John and Mary observed every detail of the room. Despite its sweet and welcoming appearance, there was something disturbing in the air. On the walls, John noticed strange marks, as if someone had scratched the sweet surface. Maria, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off a large cage in the corner of the room, partially covered by a dark cloth. The lady soon returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup, the aroma of which made the children's stomachs rumble even more. "Eat it all," she said, her eyes shining in a strange way. "You need to get your strength back." The children began to eat greedily, but John noticed that his hostess kept her eyes on them, especially on her fingers, as if she were evaluating them. The soup was delicious, but there was a strange taste that he couldn't identify, something that made his tongue tingle slightly. "What are your names, dears?" asked the lady, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I'm John, and this is my sister Mary," replied the boy, noticing that his voice sounded more slurred than usual. His head was beginning to feel heavy, and the candles seemed to create dancing shapes on the walls. "What lovely names," smiled the lady, but her smile now seemed different, more predatory. "You could call me Griselda." Maria had already finished her soup, and her eyes were beginning to close against her will. John struggled to stay alert, but his limbs felt heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw before succumbing to sleep was Griselda's smile, turning into something terrible, and her eyes glowing with a green, unearthly light. When John woke up, he found himself inside the large cage he had noticed earlier. His hands and feet were tied with ropes made of licorice, and his head was still spinning from the effects of the potion Griselda had put in his soup. Maria was in a separate cage, still unconscious. "Ah, she's finally awake," said Griselda, her voice now completely different from the melodious one that had greeted them. It was harsh and cruel, matching her true appearance, which was now revealed. A witch with long, twisted fingers, a pointed nose and eyes that shone with an ancient malice. "What are you going to do to us?" asked John, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "Oh, my dear," laughed the witch, the sound resembling fingernails scratching a blackboard. "You'll be my dinner, of course. But first, I need to fatten you up a bit. You're too thin for a good meal." At that moment, Maria began to awaken, her eyes widening in horror as she realized her situation. The witch approached her cage, appraising her with critical eyes. "The girl first," decided Griselda. "Younger children are always more tender." John felt his blood run cold. "No," he shouted, shaking the bars of his cage. "Leave my sister alone." The witch only laughed, a horrible sound that made the sweets on the walls shake. Don't worry, little one. Your shift will come soon. But first, let's start feeding your little sister properly. Thus began a terrible period for the siblings. The witch forced Mary to eat huge quantities of sweets and treats, while John was fed only hard breadcrumbs. Her plan was clear. She wanted to fatten Mary up first, keeping John too weak to try anything. But the witch didn't count on the children's cunning. During the evenings, when Griselda retired to her room upstairs, John and Mary whispered to each other, planning their escape. Maria had noticed that the witch had very poor eyesight and relied mainly on her sense of smell and touch to guide her. John, for his part, carefully observed the witch's routine, memorizing every detail of her habits. Every morning, Griselda would check on Maria's progress by asking her to extend a finger through the bars of the cage. The witch poked it, grumbling about how the girl was still too thin. What she didn't know was that Maria, following John's idea, had started extending a small chicken bone they had found on the floor of the cage, deceiving the witch about her true state. The days turned into weeks, and the witch's patience began to wear thin. Maria remained thin despite all the food, and John, although weak from lack of food, kept his mind sharp, observing and planning. The children knew they had to act soon, before Griselda realized the trick or decided she had waited long enough. One particularly dark night, while the witch was snoring in her room, John whispered to his sister, "Tomorrow, Maria. Tomorrow we'll try. Remember the plan?" Maria nodded in the darkness, clutching the chicken bone in her hand. "I remember, John, but I'm scared." "I'm scared too," John admitted, "but it's our only chance. We have to outsmart her." The brothers stayed awake for the rest of the night, their hearts beating fast at the prospect of what was to come. The plan was risky, and if they failed, there certainly wouldn't be a second chance. But as John had said, it was their only hope of survival. As the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the crystallized sugar windows, the brothers heard the witch's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was time to put their plan into action and find out if their cunning would be enough to overcome the evil that held them prisoner. The sun had barely risen when Griselda descended the stairs, her heavy footsteps echoing through the candy house. She approached Maria's cage first, as she always did, her eyes emitting that greenish, evil glow. "Good morning, little one," hummed the witch in her fake voice. "Let's see if you're ready for my feast." Maria, trembling slightly, held out the chicken bone through the bars. The witch felt it with her gnarled fingers, frowning in frustration. "Impossible," exclaimed Griselda, her voice filled with rage. "How can you still be so thin with all that food?" It was at this point that John put the first part of the plan into practice. "Maybe," he said, his voice weak but determined, "she needs something more substantial than sweets." The witch turned to him, puzzled. "Go on," she ordered, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Our mother always said that roast meat was the best way to put on weight quickly," John continued, praying that his voice didn't betray his nervousness, "especially if it's well seasoned and cooked in the oven." A mischievous smile spread across the witch's wrinkled face. Yes, she murmured, rubbing her hands together. "That makes sense, and I happen to have an excellent oven." Griselda moved quickly through the kitchen, lighting the large stone oven that took up an entire wall. The flames soon began to crackle, casting dancing shadows across the candy house. "I need to check that it's the right temperature," said the witch, more to herself than to the children. "It has to be perfect." John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was exactly what they had planned. The witch was so engrossed in her preparations that she didn't notice when John started fiddling with the lock of his cage with a piece of wire he had found a few days earlier. "Come here, little girl," Griselda ordered, opening Maria's cage. "I want you to help me check the oven." Maria hesitated, but knew she needed to keep the witch distracted while John worked on her release. She approached the oven with faltering steps, observing the flames that licked the inside of the stone structure. "I can't see properly if it's hot enough," complained the witch, her poor eyes hampering her assessment. "Get in there and tell me how the flames are." Maria took a step back, feigning fear. "I don't know how to do that," she said, her voice trembling. Griselda snorted with impatience. "You fool. Just go in and look. Like this, look." The witch leaned into the oven, demonstrating what she wanted Maria to do. At that very moment, John finally managed to open his cage. With an agility that surprised even him, considering his weakness, he jumped out and ran silently to his sister. The moment the witch was leaning completely over the oven, John and Mary gathered all their strength and pushed her over. Griselda let out a horrifying scream as she fell into the burning oven. Maria quickly closed the heavy iron door, while John locked the bolt. The witch's screams and imprecations echoed through the candy house, making the gingerbread walls shake. The children hugged each other, their hearts beating wildly, as the sounds diminished until they ceased altogether. "We did it," whispered Maria, still hardly believing it. But there was no time for celebration. John was already rummaging through the house, looking for supplies to take with him on his escape. In the kitchen, they found a cloth bag which they filled with bread and dried fruit. Maria discovered a small chest full of gold coins and jewelry, probably stolen from other victims of the witch. "Should we take it?" she asked hesitantly. John considered for a moment before replying, "Yes. We can use it to help our family and other needy people in the village." As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary began to happen. The candy house began to melt and crumble, as if the witch's death had broken some enchantment that kept it standing. Chocolate dripped down the walls, and the crystallized sugar on the windows dissolved like snow in the sun. "Quick," shouted John, grabbing his sister's hand. "We got to get out of here." The children ran out of the collapsing house, carrying their precious supplies. Behind them, the magical construction had completely melted away, leaving only a giant puddle of melted sweets on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky now, and for the first time in weeks, John and Mary could feel its rays warming their faces. The forest seemed different, less threatening. It was as if the witch's death had dispelled a dark mist that hung over that part of the forest. "Which way should we go?" asked Maria, looking around. John closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his mother used to tell him about how to find your way around the forest. "Moss always grows on the north side of the trees," he said, "and our village lies to the south of the deep forest." So the brothers began their journey home, stronger and wiser than when they had been abandoned. The weight of the sack of provisions and the treasure chest was barely noticeable, so great was their relief at being free. As they walked, they talked about what they would tell their father and how they could use the witch's gold to help not only their family, but the whole community that was suffering from hunger. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when they spotted a familiar puff of smoke rising above the trees. "It's the chimney of the blacksmith's house," exclaimed Maria, recognizing the pattern of the smoke. The brothers' hearts were filled with renewed hope. They were almost home, but they knew that their adventure had changed their lives forever. They were no longer just two frightened children in the forest. They were survivors who had faced evil and won through their cunning and brotherly love. "Dad, Father," Maria's joyful cries cut through the air as she and John ran towards the little wooden house they knew so well. The woodcutter, who was sitting on a tree stump in front of the house with his face buried in his hands, raised his head when he heard the familiar voices of his children. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, widened in disbelief. In an instant, he was on his feet, running towards the children with open arms. The encounter was an explosion of emotions. Tears, hugs, and words of joy and regret. "My children, my dear children," the father sobbed, clutching them to his chest as if he feared they would disappear again. "Forgive me, please forgive me. I should never have—" "It's all right, Dad," John interrupted, his voice soft and understanding. "We know you had no choice." His stepmother, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her normally stern face showed signs of surprise and, curiously, relief. In the days since abandoning the children, the weight of her decision had begun to eat away at her conscience. "You've come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But how?" Maria and John looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They decided at that moment that some parts of their story would be better kept secret. After all, who would believe a house made of sweets in an evil witch? "We found help in the forest," replied John diplomatically, adjusting the weight of the bag of provisions on his shoulders. "And we brought something that can help not only our family, but the whole village. Carefully, he opened the sack and showed its contents, first revealing the food they had collected. Then Maria presented the small chest. When she opened it, the glitter of gold and jewels made the adult's eyes widen in amazement. "Mercy!" exclaimed the stepmother, putting her hands to her mouth. "Where did all this come from?" "It's a gift," said Maria firmly, "to help people who are starving." In the weeks that followed, remarkable transformation took place in the small village. The treasure found by the children was used wisely. They bought seeds to plant, animals to raise, and tools to work the land. The father, now freed from the constant worry about immediate survival, was able to devote his time to teaching other families more efficient farming techniques. The stepmother, touched by the generosity of the children she had condemned, changed profoundly. Her heart, previously hardened by bitterness and fear of hunger, began to open. She became a central figure in organizing community efforts, ensuring that no family went without. John and Mary grew up respected in the community, not only for their mysterious good fortune, but above all for the wisdom they showed despite their young age. At night, when the younger children of the village gathered around the fire, they would tell stories, some true, some imagined, about the dangers and wonders of the deep forest. Sometimes, when they were alone, the brothers would talk about their adventure in the candy house. Although the horror of those days never completely left them, they also remembered how that experience had strengthened the bond between them and taught them valuable lessons about courage, cunning, and the importance of trusting each other. "You know, John," Maria said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the attic window they still shared, "sometimes I wonder if other lost children found that clearing after the candy house melted." John smiled, taking his sister's hand. "If they did, I hope they only found wild flowers and edible mushrooms. The witch is gone, and with her her evil magic." Time passed, and the story of John and Mary became a legend in the village, whispered from generation to generation. It told of two children who faced adversity with courage and came back not only with gold, but with something much more valuable: the wisdom that true treasure lies in the love between siblings and the strength that comes from facing fears together. The winters were still harsh, but the village was now prepared to face them. The families had learned to work together, share resources, and look after each other. And when the snow covered the roofs and the wind howled through the trees, people gathered in their warm homes, telling stories about two brave children who changed the fate of an entire community. John and Mary grew up keeping the memory of their adventure alive, not as a horror story, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope and cunning can light the way back home.